The day I became the youngest CEO in Hansung history, 3 cameras flashed at once, and I learned how empty applause could sound when it finally belonged to me. People outside the company would have called it a miracle. 42 years old, youngest chief executive in Hansung history, stock up on the quarter, electronics division stabilized, heavy components cleaned after a restructuring nobody was supposed to remember too clearly. Reporters loved the story. Poor boy from a decent school, climbed through strategy, survived internal wars, outlasted better-born men who had inherited smoother hallways than mine ever were. The chairman stood beside me in the board hall and called me proof that Hansung rewarded merit. He lied beautifully. Hansung rewarded usefulness. Merit was just the ribbon it tied around the throat before pulling. I stood under the lights, bowed at the correct angle, shook the right hands, delivered the right sentences about responsibility, global competitiveness, and protecting shareholder trust. The room loved me because I had become exactly the kind of man that room knew how to love. Calm in public, sharp in private, expensive but disciplined, never sentimental when numbers were on the table. Never visibly shaken by layoffs, labor fights, supplier pressure, or a quarter bad enough to send whole teams home with cardboard boxes and clipped smiles. Then the ceremony ended, the board dispersed, and I was left alone in the executive corridor with a phone full of congratulations from people who would have sold my sleep for one more point of operating margin. There was one message that mattered more than the rest. It was from my ex-wife. Congratulations, I hope it was worth the climb. No anger, no softness, just distance. That was what made it precise enough to hurt. She had left 2 years earlier, not because of one affair or one catastrophic betrayal, but because she finally understood that every room I entered already owned a percentage of me before I came home. My mother died while I was in Shanghai forcing a supplier to stop lying about component yield. My best friend Jinhwan died in a parking structure after signing his name under a pile of operational dirt that belonged to men still collecting bonuses. Director CEO, the only senior who had ever taught me how to think without perfume on the truth, retired with his stomach ruined and his eyes permanently tired. By the time I reached the top, I had enough authority to move billions of one with one call, and not enough people left beside me to make the call feel human. That night I sat alone in the company apartment by the river with a glass of whiskey I didn't even like and looked at soul reflected black in the window. I thought about how the climb had really worked. Not as a fairy tale, not as talent rewarded, as sequence, knowing which man to stand behind while another one fell, knowing when to tell the truth and when to let somebody else discover it too late to save himself, knowing how to move through meetings like a clean knife, knowing the cost of every concession and paying it anyway when the ceiling above me still looked just out of reach. The company made people think success meant arriving at the top. That was the first lie. The truth was uglier. Success was agreeing, piece by piece, to become the kind of person who could survive every necessary room without vomiting afterward. The river looked cold, the room looked expensive, my own reflection looked like a well-dressed corpse. I remember thinking one small, mean, exhausted thought. If I had another chance, I could climb this company in half the time. Then another thought followed it so fast it almost felt like an answer. No, half the time wasn't the point. The point was climbing it before it taught me the same wrong lessons again. My chest tightened hard enough to make the glass slip in my hand. The lights outside broke apart. For 1 second I thought the company had finally found the cleanest way to finish using me. When I opened my eyes, I was staring at the underside of a cheap steel desk. My cheek hurt, my back ached from bad posture instead of age. My suit was wrong, not executive wrong, rookie wrong, off-the-rack shoulders, cheap collar, fabric that still believed office life was only a temporary inconvenience. Somebody nearby was stirring powdered coffee with the desperation of a man too junior to admit he hated the taste. I sat up too fast and cracked my head on the desk frame. 3 faces turned. One of them belonged to Jinhwan. Alive. 22 or 23, depending on whether the calendar had already crossed his birthday that year. Cheap navy suit, 2 long sideburns, nervous, decent face. The same kind eyes that in my first life the company had mistaken for capacity to absorb endless pressure. He was standing by the filing shelf holding 2 paper cups and frowning at me exactly the way he used to whenever I worked too late and forgot what my body was for. "You okay?" he asked. "You look like you saw a ghost." I stood up so fast the chair rolled backward and hit the partition. Then I grabbed him by the shoulders. He swore, coffee sloshed. The whole row went silent. "Jinhwan," I said. He stared. Yes, that's normally how names work. He was warm, alive, confused, no blood on the concrete, no bent parking rail behind him, No final call I answered too late because I was in a meeting deciding how to phrase a plant incident for investors. Just Jinhwan, solid and startled, and wearing a tie so ugly only a first-year employee would have chosen it himself. I let go slowly. The wall calendar by team leader Choi's glass office said March 3, 2001. My first day. Not my first year, my first day. The rush of understanding did not feel holy, it felt tactical. 20 years. Back to the beginning. Back before the first false loyalty, before the first strategic compromise, before the long chain of necessary wins that had slowly taught me how to call damage discipline. Back before Jinhwan got trained into being everybody's polite shock absorber. Back before my mother started measuring my exhaustion by the pauses on the phone. Back before Minjeong looked at me like she had already figured out what kind of executive I could become, and was deciding whether that was a reason to trust me or leave. My body was young. My mind was. Every future fracture line I had ever bled on was suddenly in front of me again, not as memory, but as upcoming work. Jinhwan recovered first. He shoved one of the paper cups into my hand and muttered, "If you were trying to make an unforgettable first impression, I think the floor already has that covered." I looked around. Sales planning 7th floor, building 2, beige partitions, bad carpet, fluorescent tubes too bright for skin, cheap motivational slogan on the far wall. We do not chase tomorrow, we build it. In the old life I had looked at that slogan and felt intimidated. This time I looked at it and thought, no, you don't. You mortgage it, rename the debt, and call the pain below you discipline. The office clock said 8:41. In 19 minutes, team leader Choi would storm out of his office, ask who had prepared the Daehan retail comparison sheet, and humiliate me in front of the whole floor because the file on his desk was the wrong revision. In the first life that moment trained me. I took the hit, apologized, and learned the company's first lesson the way good boys always do. Quietly. Not this time. I put the coffee down. Jinhwan frowned. "Where are you going?" "To save us both some time." That sentence sounds bad. It's actually the first good one of the day. And I started moving before my second life had fully even begun. The trick to changing a life early is not grand courage, it's precision. I already knew assistant manager Park had borrowed the correct Daehan retail sheet from the shared file tray 40 minutes earlier, marked it for his own notes, and put the older version back by mistake because he believed detail work happened naturally around men like him. Park wasn't a true villain. Those are rarer in offices than people think. He was more dangerous than that. Careless, status-conscious. Exactly moral enough to think he deserved sympathy whenever his own laziness hurt someone lower in the room. I went straight to the records alcove, pulled the right folder from the third tray, and walked back out just as team leader Choi burst from his office with 2 pages in hand and murder on his face. "Who prepared the Daehan comparison?" he barked. In the first life, I hesitated half a second too long. That half second cost me 3 years of how they saw me. This time I stepped forward before the sentence finished landing. "I did. The revision on your desk should be the older one. Park Nim borrowed the updated sheet earlier for vendor margin notes, so I brought the correct file." Silence. Park turned his head so slowly, I almost respected the reptilian control. Choi looked at me, then at the pages on his desk, then at Park. The room understood what had happened before anyone said it out loud. That was enough. Offices don't need formal proof to start reclassifying people. They only need the right embarrassment in the right direction. Choi slapped both versions down on Park's desk. "If you borrow a rookie's working file, return the correct one. We are not a daycare." Park stood too fast and nearly hit his knee. "Yes, team leader, I was only." "I do not care what you were only." Then Choi looked at me again. "Han." "Yes, sir." "Don't get clever." In the first life I would have apologized. This time I bowed and said, "I'll aim for useful instead." That held his attention 1 second longer than usual. Good. Useful always travels farther in a company than likable, and much farther than talented. Talent frightens people. Usefulness gives them time to pretend you belong to them. Morning briefing went roughly as I remembered. Choi tore apart the weekly retail numbers, humiliated a second-year analyst for confusing booked movement with actual sell-through, and dumped 3 branch call summaries on me because nobody else wanted the fieldwork. Park spent the whole meeting pretending he had recovered from the file incident gracefully. He hadn't. By lunch the whole floor had already decided I was either lucky, dangerous, or annoying. Fine. All 3 were better than harmless. Jinhwan cornered me at the vending machine after 11:30, with the look of a man trying to decide whether his new friend had suffered a concussion or a revelation. "You know what's weird?" he asked. "Probably several things. You were panicking under your desk at 8:40, and by 9, you sounded like you'd already been in this division for 3 years. Maybe I adapt fast." That's not a real answer. It's the best one available. He held my gaze another second, then laughed the way he always did when confusion and affection reached a draw. "Fine, just don't adapt so fast you turn into Park." "Cruel?" "Correct." We took our trays to the cafeteria together, and that is where the second major turn of my second life arrived earlier than it had any right to. Director Seo stood by the soup station reading a fax. He was younger, naturally, but even at that age he already carried the same severe stillness that once made half the company think he was heartless. He was. He simply saw the useless parts of human performance too quickly to reward them with expression. In the original timeline, I didn't really enter his orbit until a microwave tray defect exploded into executive panic years later. By then he already knew how the company worked, and I only knew how to survive it. This time I had something more dangerous than potential. I had sequence. I walked up to him with my tray in both hands and said, "If the fax from Decent says the tray defect ratio stabilized under 3%, the number is dressed." He lowered the paper slowly, "And you are Yuhyeon sales planning." That explains the suit, not the sentence. Fair? I set my tray down carefully because one thing I remembered about Seo was that he respected men who put the burden of clarity on themselves first. The ratio looks clean if they count shipped units against recorded claims. It stops looking clean if you track retail return reason by week. Edge crack becomes latch split after week 4. That means tolerance drift or bad cooling, not customer mishandling. If strategic planning walks into the review with only that fax, procurement will let the wrong people call it noise. He looked at the fax again, then at me. "How do you know?" My first life, I learned that the most useful lie is one that already sounds like the kind of work nobody senior wants to do himself. "I worked part-time at a retailer near Suwon last winter," I said. "Returns desk. People don't describe manufacturing problems correctly, but they describe frustration in patterns. The pattern on this product line changed before the complaint rate did." He stared at me just long enough for discomfort to turn into evaluation. Then he took his tray, nodded toward the empty chair across from him, and said, "Sit." So I sat. That lunch bought me the first real chance at changing the company before it finished shaping me. He asked about branch complaint wording, about return lag, about whether I knew the difference between service noise and product truth. I answered carefully, not to impress, to prove I could reduce mess without deodorizing it. When he finished eating, he folded the fax once and said, "You either have excellent instincts or poor fear habits. I'd like to think both can be trained." "Everything can be trained, that's the problem." And he stood, "Come to the Decent review at 2, say nothing unless asked." The review room at 2 contained exactly the kind of men I remembered hating and eventually becoming good enough to sit beside. Vice Director O from procurement, already performing cultivated superiority. 2 manufacturing managers who had built their confidence out of lab test charts and denial. CEO at the head of the planning side. And me at the far end with a notebook, and the deeply familiar feeling that the fate of a few 100,000 units and the entire social weather of my next year might pivot on one paper file. The manufacturing side insisted the defect rate was under control. O tried to move the meeting quickly because if the issue stayed small until launch, then everybody above him kept their schedule and the branches could bleed later. CO let them talk long enough to expose their own laziness, then asked for retail return categories by week. Nobody had them. He set one handwritten page on the table, my page. "I do," he said. O read it, frowned, and looked at me for the first time. He knew instantly that the handwriting and the field terminology didn't belong to CO. That was fine. I did not need him to like me. I needed him to remember that a man he had not priced yet had entered the room with information he had missed. I-5, Decent's line was on audit hold. Procurement was furious, and team leader Choi was looking at me like someone had quietly switched the labels on one of his most ordinary tools. That was how the first day ended in my second life. Not with humiliation. With a warning. The company had noticed me earlier than before. Good. Dangerous. Necessary. Strategic planning did not recruit people. It posed pressure tolerance. That was the first useful thing Minjiang ever said to me. By the time the Decent issue finished spitting smoke, Director CEO had already started borrowing me for side reviews whenever a file needed field truth translated into language the executive floor could consume without choking. Team leader Choi pretended to resent it and very clearly enjoyed the reflected prestige. Park moved from hostility to caution, which is what small men do once they realize the ladder under them might belong to someone else's hand now. Jinhwan watched the whole thing with equal parts fascination and dread. "You're getting pulled upstairs," he said one evening as we waited for the elevator under bad fluorescent light. "Maybe." "That's not a maybe face. That's an I've already decided what tie to wear when I ruin my own life face. I'm touched by how carefully you study me. I'm trying to protect my lunch breaks." Wasn't wrong. By then I had already started using every spare minute to read past the obvious file path, supplier approval chains, service exception logs, branch complaint vocabulary. Men at the top think strategy lives in white papers and market share graphs. Most of the time it lives in what the field is too tired to say elegantly. I knew because I had spent 20 years learning to turn those ugly truths into clean presentations for people who like the result better than the cause. The first real transfer didn't come through a ceremony. It came through a refrigerator. Hansung Home Appliances had scheduled a premium refrigerator launch for late summer. Better insulation, new digital controls, expensive silver finish, ad campaign designed to tell upper-middle-class Seoul families that buying cold air from us meant they had arrived. In the original timeline, the launch looked smooth for exactly 1/4. Then compressor failures began clustering in high-humidity districts, and the company spent a year calling it a service learning issue, instead of admitting procurement had cut a dirty supplier deal to protect margin. I smelled the same lie in June 2001, before anyone above manager rank said the word concern. Supplier code changes. Inspection variants parked under a new reporting bucket. One cost dip too neat to be raw material luck. And most usefully, 3 branch service chiefs describing demo unit startup noise with the exact irritation older men use when they already know headquarters is lying to itself again. I built the risk packet over 2 nights. No heroics, just careful assembly. Supplier tables, variance coding, 4 branch notes, 1 estimate of what clustered compressor failures would do to first-year premium brand trust if the launch proceeded uncorrected. Then I put it in front of CEO at 7:13 a.m. before the rest of the floor had fully remembered how to hate Tuesday. He read it in silence. Then he asked, "Who else has seen this?" "No one important." That answer keeps getting worse. It stays accurate. He put one finger on the supplier table. "If this is wrong, you've just tried to delay a premium launch on branch gossip and pattern anxiety. If it's right, we save ourselves a public apology in rich neighborhoods." He stared a second longer. Then he said, "Come to the task force meeting, and don't speak until the room proves it deserves the words." That was CEO's version of trust. The recovery task force introduced me to Kang Minjeong. Corporate marketing, 1 year older, tabs in her folders sorted by function instead of chronology, which meant she built cases for live rooms, not dead archives. Sharp mouth, sharper instincts, no interest in sounding agreeable if accuracy would do more work. She entered the first meeting, scanned the faces, listened to Home Appliances complain that strategic planning was overreacting to provisional field noise, and asked, "Has anyone in this room actually heard the units in a customer home, or are we all still dating the spreadsheet version?" It was so rude and so useful I nearly laughed. That meeting set the pattern for everything after. Product wanted to protect the schedule. Procurement wanted to protect the supplier. Finance wanted to protect the quarter. Marketing wanted not to build a premium campaign on top of a hidden mechanical problem. CEO wanted the truth to arrive before the launch did. I wanted the same thing for a different reason. I had already watched the future version of this disaster teach the company all the wrong lessons. The audit held the supplier. The launch slipped 6 weeks. Everyone screamed. Good. And companies scream before customers do. That is sometimes the cleanest outcome available. The harder fight was what to do after the delay. Product wanted the same ad campaign later. Sales wanted heavier channel incentives. Finance wanted all recovery costs pushed into downstream service rather than upfront brand support. Minjeong took one look at the revised deck and said, "This still sounds like a company pretending confidence can replace trust." That line changed the whole room. She rebuilt the marketing frame around transparency and premium reassurance instead of fake inevitability. Longer warranty, installation verification, direct service scheduling for the first quarter, fewer channels, better channels, Sell confidence, not perfection. It was obvious once she said it, which is how you know a real strategist has entered the building. We worked together for 2 straight weeks after that. Days in the task force room. Nights in the 11th floor pantry, or the side conference alcove nobody booked because the ventilation made it sound haunted. I handled branches, field complaints, and internal numbers. She handled how the customer would hear the company once all the internal lies were stripped away. She never softened her criticism for my age. I respected her for it immediately. One night around 11:20, with the whole building reduced to cleaning staff, tired printers, and the low hum of men still trying to make tomorrow less embarrassing than today, she dropped a revised deck beside my keyboard and tapped a paragraph with her pen. "You're surviving the room again," she said. I frowned. What does that mean? It means this section says what's safe enough for executives to hear, not what the market actually needs from us. I read the paragraph. She was right. I hated that she was right so quickly. In the first life, it took me years to understand how often I was trimming truth into presentable shapes before I had even fully admitted it to myself. This time the correction came from a woman in a black cardigan, eating stale crackers in a dead conference room, while the summer launch of a refrigerator line hung in the balance. So I rewrote it. Cleaner, more dangerous, more honest. The revised recovery deck explicitly said the premium line could no longer ask customers for faith. It had to buy back confidence through design transparency, service certainty, and a retail script that stopped pretending inconvenience was beneath the product category. Finance hated it. Product said it implied weakness. Kang, when the deck finally reached him, read 2 pages, looked at me and said, "Who removed the deodorant from this presentation?" "Reality," Minjiang said before I could. He almost smiled. Good, bad sign, useful. The relaunch worked. Not magically, not beautifully, but well enough to save the line, stabilize the quarter, and pull my name into rooms where 22-year-old assistant-grade nobodies did not usually appear. More importantly, it pulled Minjiang upward too. Not enough, never enough, but enough that the company had started to notice her in the right direction. That is when Kang called me into his office and told me I was being reassigned. Permanent move. Strategic planning. Project coordination support. No proper title improvement. Tiny pay bump. Bigger windows. Colder knives. "Do you know why I'm moving you now?" he asked. "Because I'm useful." That describes staplers. Because I'm useful in rooms that cost more. There it was again, that tiny dangerous almost smile. Better, and because I'd rather have you where I can see your mistakes before other people start profiting from them. I took the transfer. Of course I did. Because at that point, I was no longer climbing for the same reason as the first life. Then, I climbed because I wanted never to be helpless in a room again. Now I climbed because I had seen what this company did to people if no one with memory and appetite interrupted the sequence early enough. Also because Jinhwan was still alive, my mother still answered my calls, and Director Seo had not yet been ground down into the smaller, sicker version of himself that the future had once called mature. Those were reasons too. Good reasons. The better the reasons, the harder you have to watch yourself on the way up. The Gumi file arrived in October under a neutral name, and the smell of a future disaster I had already lived through once. Dejin Components. Mid-tier supplier. Tooling strong. Debt ugly. Labor structure worse. Current acquisition interest active. On paper it was a sensible defensive buy. Secure supply chain. Pull strategic manufacturing closer. Deny foreign competitors cheap access. In the first life the company bought Dejin anyway, fast and stupid. 18 months later the debt pressure rolled downhill. Local management cut maintenance and staffing to protect targets. Labor burned, export delivery confidence shattered, and I learned how to dress death in investor language while pretending it was weather. This time I knew what to smell. Seo gave me the initial file because by then he had stopped pretending my instincts were coincidence. Kang wanted an exposure summary before the executive line committed. Vice President Oh wanted the deal to move quickly enough that finance could package the pain cleanly after the signatures. The chairman's office wanted growth posture analysis, which in practice means tell us whether the future damage can be delayed until applause finishes. I read until 1 in the morning and found the obvious rot immediately. Debt timing hidden across subsidiaries. Line maintenance already squeezed. Temporary worker dependence rising, while official staffing remained disciplined. Recruiter note implying supervisor churn higher than the public file admitted. And one local budget transfer so small it looked almost innocent, unless you knew those numbers later turned into dead sleep and broken backs on factory floors. I took it to CEO. He believed the numbers in 3 minutes. Then he asked the question that mattered. What would you do if this were your decision? In my first life, if a senior had asked that, I would have assumed it was praise in disguise and answered too politely. This time I answered like the room had no time for ego. Ring-fence maintenance and staffing before the acquisition closes. Separate plant obligations from the growth story. If they buy the company and delay the labor truth until after the board prays, the local directors will squeeze output first and accountability last. Then the first crisis becomes moral instead of operational. CEO tapped the debt sheet once. That's a strong sentence for an assistant-grade man. It's a cheap sentence compared to a burned plant manager. That got his attention exactly the way I wanted. The Yuhyeon site visit happened under procurement cover because Seoul executives only see truth in factories if the workers have been denied enough warning to polish it first. I brought Jinhwan with me, partly because I trusted him, partly because the future version of him had learned too much of the wrong passivity, and I wanted this younger one to start seeing structures before they started using his good nature as padding. Yuhyeon smelled like wet steel, machine oil, instant noodles, and men who had stopped believing headquarters knew what their bodies were worth. The plant manager lied in the first 5 minutes. The maintenance chief told the truth in the next 4 because he hated the lie more than he feared me. That alone told me enough about the whole place. When workers tell strangers the truth faster than they tell their own management, your leadership structure is already failing. Section Chief Beak from line maintenance ended up being the most useful man in the building. Broad hands. Cigarette voice. Permanent expression of somebody measuring whether you deserved his contempt or only his irritation. Showed us the compressor assembly line, a coolant housing held together longer than any sane maintenance cycle allowed, and a supervisor rotation so thin the night line was effectively being managed by men too tired to distinguish caution from delay. Then he took me outside beside the side loading bay, lit a cigarette under a no-smoking sign, and said, "If Seoul buys Daejeon the fast way, they'll ask us to act grateful before they ask us whether the machines can survive it." That sentence alone was worth the trip. When I got back to Seoul, I built the clearest acquisition risk memo of my life to that point. No scented language. No growth perfume. Just sequence. If the acquisition moved without labor and maintenance protection, then productivity pressure would arrive before trust. Hidden fatigue would turn into error. Error would turn into injury or visible conflict. And the company would later call it unforeseeable integration strain, while pretending the men making those choices had never seen a factory after midnight. Kang read the memo and said, "You write like somebody older and angrier than your personnel file. Maybe the file S behind. Be careful, companies correct that." He still carried the risk forward. That was the useful thing about Kang. He did not care whether the truth was pretty. He cared whether it could be priced in time to protect his own future authority. That made him dangerous and, in the right season, usable. The executive review on Daejeon went exactly as memory promised, and completely differently because I arrived armed. O wanted the debt wrapped in optimism. Product wanted supply security, talked about like destiny. Finance wanted local burden delayed until post-acquisition. CEO wanted the pain on the page before the signatures. I wanted the future changed. When labor finally entered the room, O dismissed it as social volatility. I should have stayed silent. Instead I said, social volatility is what executives call the bill when they've already spent the people. The room went quiet in a way that made even me briefly aware of my rank. Kang, to my surprise, backed the line instead of cutting me off, not the phrasing, the logic. He reframed the risk in board language and forced the maintenance reserve and staffing review into the deal structure. It did not stop the acquisition. It made the first layer of future harm more expensive to ignore. That was enough for the time being. Yuhyeon stayed dangerous. It did not become the body pile I remembered. More importantly, Jinhwan saw the mechanism early. On the train back to Seoul, while the lights outside kept slipping past the window like unfinished thoughts, he asked, "Do factories always feel like that?" "Like what?" "Like everyone's pretending they don't know who gets hurt first." I looked at him. Really looked. This was the first new version of him. Not yet strong. Not yet hardened. just less innocent in a useful direction. Yes, I said, that's why you have to learn to read the room before you touch the paperwork. He laughed once without humor. That's a terrible lesson. It's a necessary one. He leaned back, shut his eyes, and said, you know what scares me most? That you're traveling with me. No, that you say things like this like you already paid for them. I looked out the window instead of at him. That was one of the first times the second life really hurt. Not because he was accusing. Because he was right. I had paid. I just wasn't done paying, apparently. Saving a deal is easy compared to saving a person from the kind of slow administrative death a company calls routine. Jinhwan's first real trap in the second life arrived through expense review. Not fraud. That would have been simpler. Misclassification. Ranch dinners billed under the wrong code, transport variants folded into client relationship support. A dozen little approvals routed through one active reviewer because the managers above him preferred not to let their names touch the dirtiest edges of ordinary corruption. In the first life, he signed those chains for years, not because he was corrupt, because he wanted to be useful, and the company knew exactly how to turn that desire into unpaid complicity. This time I caught the pattern the day the memo hit his desk. He came over holding the file with that same half-worried, half-pleased expression honest men wear when the company finally trusts them with something ugly. Looks like I'm finally getting real work. I stood up before he finished the sentence. Don't sign anything. He blinked to what? Not one line until we read the source chain. It's just expense review. In Hansung, those are the 3 words written right before a funeral in smaller font. He laughed because he thought I was exaggerating. Then he saw my face and stopped. I took the folder, opened to the appendix, and showed him the routing pattern. Sales approval touchpoints with no sales authority attached. Branch entertainment costs tied to quarter-end client care. One reclassification note using the exact internal phrase standard alignment, which in my experience translated cleanly to some senior man wants the benefit without the signature. If you sign this, I said, tapping the page, you become the cleanest active name on a dirty chain. His face changed slowly. Park gave me this. Yes. He said it was routine. Routine is how this company hides teeth. He sat down on the corner of my desk and read the file again, slower. Okay, so what do I do? The same question. Another year. Higher stakes. Clarify structurally, I said. Send it back for source confirmation from product and final coding sign-off from the managers who benefit from the category. CC Choi, not Park. That makes Park look bad. That makes the file visible. He was quiet for a while, then he said, I don't know when you got like this. I did. That was the problem. He sent the file back. Park was furious. Choi backed the clarification because once a dirty chain is visible, smart middle managers would rather look cautious than loyal to stupidity. The expense review died in 3 days. Jinhwan's name stayed off the poison line. That should have been enough to satisfy me. Instead, it made me angrier. Because once you know how these traps work, you start seeing them everywhere. In admin women who never get title correction because their invisibility keeps the floor quiet. In service staff blamed for tone issues after customers finally break under repeated product failure. In plant supervisors rewarded for resilience until resilience becomes collapsed sleep and numb risk tolerance. In marketing, where Minjiang was already outperforming men above her and being described in the polite back channels as impressive, but intense for her age. Intense for her age. I wanted to set the phrase on fire. She found out before I could say anything because women in companies always hear the real room earlier than men think. We were reviewing handset launch slides in the 11th floor pantry when she set her pen down and said, 2 senior managers think I'm too aggressive for brand leadership. You want names? No, I want better numbers. That answer did something clean to my brain. In the first life, I respected strength. In the second, I had started recognizing precision as its own species of power. The handset launch war that year became our first true partnership. Not romance. Not even close. Alignment under pressure. The product itself wasn't bad. The company's lie around it was. Too much volume stuffed into channels. Too much fake universal messaging. Too little clarity on who the phone was actually for. In the old timeline, I helped turn that confusion into a presentation, let executives pat themselves for a quarter, and watch the inventory poison spread later. This time, Minjiang and I tore the whole thing apart before the rot settled. She handled the market logic. I handled the internal math. Together, we built two versions of the truth. One the room wanted. One the business needed. That is a skill I learned too well in the first life. Always know both. Not because compromise is noble, because if you only build the truth nobody senior can survive hearing, then the lie wins by default. You need the real answer and the survivable path into it. The old me stopped there too often and let survivability become the whole goal. This time I held both in my hands and made sure the real answer was still the spine. King saw that. Of course he did. He called me into his office after reading the revised handset deck and asked, "Do you know why I keep using you?" "Because you enjoy risk as long as it signs upward." That got me the thin, dangerous smile. "Because you understand that strategy is not the truth. It is the route by which truth arrives in a room without dying at the door." I'm not sure that's a compliment. It's a warning. He leaned back. "If you keep this pace, someone will eventually ask what exactly you want." That question stayed with me long after I left his office. Because ambition is easy to explain in corporate language. Promotion, influence, title, decision rights. What I actually wanted was harder to phrase without sounding naive. I wanted fewer people buried under necessary outcomes. I wanted the climb without the rot disguised as maturity. I wanted to reach the center early enough that the company would have to adjust around someone who still remembered what damage looked like from the floor. That is not a normal answer in a company. It barely qualifies as one in a human life. But it was mine. And once I admitted it to myself, the next few years stopped feeling like a revenge run and started feeling more like construction under hostile weather. My mother noticed the change before anyone else understood it clearly enough to name. That's how mothers win. Not by analysis. By seeing the shape of your damage before your own pride lets you call it by species. In the first life I used work as a translation barrier with her. I told her enough to sound dutiful, never enough to sound afraid. By the time she got sick, half of what mattered in me had already been outsourced to meeting rooms. This time I went to dinner more often, took the train to her neighborhood even when it felt inefficient, let her cook soup and ask impossible questions. One Sunday after the handset review win, she put down her chopsticks, looked at me over the steam and said, "You're succeeding too fast to still think this is about proving yourself." I laughed because the line was too clean. Should I be worried? You should be careful. That sounds like the same thing but in a better cardigan. She ignored that. Men who climb early always start by saying they want to protect something, their family, their future, their pride. Later they still say the same words, but now they mean the company's definition of those things. That's when trouble begins. I sat there in my younger body with 20 years of older memory and felt seen in a way even Minjiang or Seo couldn't quite manage, because neither of them had carried me before I learned what language could hide. "I know," I said. "No," she refilled my bowl. "You remember, that's different." That line went into me like medicine. Remembering is passive. Knowing is operational. I needed both. So I built rules for myself after that dinner. Not a checklist. I hate checklists when they pretend conscience can be itemized. Rules. If a plan looked clean only because the human cost had been moved into a phrase, I would not repeat the phrase without dragging the cost back into the room. If protecting a person started turning into speaking over them, I would stop and correct. If a win required making somebody invisible afterward, I would count that as a debt, not a triumph. If I heard myself using the company's favorite euphemisms too smoothly, I would go to my mother, or Jinhwan, or Minjiang, or any place with enough honesty left to make the language sound ugly again. It helped. Not enough to keep me clean. Enough to keep me awake. The Ulsan flood taught me the next lesson. Not that factories are fragile. I already knew that. That the chairman notices courage only after it has already passed through usefulness. When the runoff warning hit and I got dragged into the emergency response line, I wasn't thinking about visibility. I was thinking about calibration rooms, export penalties, local managers lying upward, and one future version of myself who had once cleaned the investor messaging after the same event because the company had arrived too late and still insisted on calling it unfortunate weather. This time we got there in time. Barely. Enough to save the line, the contract, and the narrative. Chairman Han coming to the yard in person changed one thing. It made the whole crisis impossible to shrink later into local incompetence. That is what powerful witnesses are for in bad systems. Not moral leadership. Narrative control. When he asked, "Whose man are you?" and Seo answered, "Mine for the night," I understood something that took me too many years in the original life. In companies like Hansung, belonging is not safety. It is temporary sponsorship in rooms where ownership of your usefulness is still being negotiated. The chairman's later comment was worse. Learn to separate rescue from sentiment. That was the creed beneath all the other creeds. Do the right-looking thing, but do it cold enough that you can keep moving afterward. Call detachment discipline. Call distance maturity. Call damage collateral and then sleep. I hated him more for saying it accurately. Because men like him survive by mastering the exact point where genuine competence curdles into morally elegant cruelty. I had lived too close to that line before. This time I meant to keep seeing it. The first ethics review war with Vice President O tested that harder than any flood did. Tried to weaponize hospitality audits to pin dirty expense chains on men like Seo and disposable middle names like Jinhwan, while preserving his own discretionary corruption under a better title. In the first life, I would have navigated the room more politely. This time, I took the pattern to Kang and forced the war wider. Not because Kang was good, because his appetite made him incapable of letting O hold a knife alone if a second blade could preserve his own leverage too. That saved Seo. Partially. Temporarily. Enough. It also taught me something I still hate, but know is true. Sometimes you save the better man by feeding a worse one exactly the right amount of ammunition. There is no clean pride in that. Only consequence management. I went to my mother's apartment after the review closed and told her a version of the truth, not the political detail, the moral shape, that I had stopped a worse man by arming another bad one, that the outcome was right enough to live with and still felt dirty in my mouth. She listened while slicing fruit and said, "Then don't celebrate the dirt just because the wound closed." That was all. Again, better than any leadership seminar in Seoul. The external offer from Jin Tae-woo complicated everything further because it proved the company wasn't the only machine willing to admire what I was becoming. He saw me too clearly too early. Men like that are dangerous because they make ambition feel understood instead of managed. He offered faster rise, better pay, less family gravity, more room to move. It was tempting not because I wanted escape, because he described the shape of my frustration correctly. I still said no. Not out of loyalty to Hansung. Out of unfinished business. There were still too many rooms inside that company where the old future version of me had lied, trimmed, or arrived too late. I wasn't leaving before I changed enough of the slope that the next men climbing it had different ground under their shoes. That sounds noble written plainly. It didn't feel noble living it. It felt like work. It felt like calling my mother on Wednesdays when I wanted to collapse instead. It felt like making Jinhwan read the source chain before signing anything. It felt like letting Minjeong say, "Stand beside me, not in front," and actually obeying. It felt like stealing load from Seo before his body converted truth-telling into blood. It felt like choosing the cleaner lie when the whole table insisted on some lie, and then driving the truth into the spine anyway so it could still force the pivot later. It felt like not getting to pretend I was innocent just because my reasons were better this time. Good, innocence is useless at altitude. Memory is not. The first time the chairman's son really hated me, it happened over a slide deck. And Suman was many things his public image made easy to misread. He wasn't stupid. That would have been comforting. He had instincts, some real discipline, and just enough awareness of his own privilege to become insecure instead of humble. The worst combination in inherited power is not ignorance. It is intermittent self-knowledge. It makes a man smart enough to feel threatened and rich enough to outsource the answer. When I got assigned to support his overseas components initiative, I knew the future version of him too well already. In the original life, he learned the wrong lessons from the wrong seniors and grew into the kind of executive who mistakes composure for moral authority. If I could shift him early, even a few degrees, it would change more than one division. The project itself was a trap dressed as growth. Localization targets too pretty. Training obligations too vague. Labor concessions disguised as partner flexibility. Procurement optimism stretched like a tablecloth over a floor full of knives. Yuhyeon presented the first version like a press release somebody had taught to wear cufflinks. I cut 3 sections, moved labor up, killed the confidence theater, and told him if he wanted the chairman to take him seriously, he needed to stop selling tomorrow with next year's apology already built into the file. He stared at me for a long second. Do you talk to everyone like this? Only people with enough power to survive honesty. That irritated him. Good. He needed irritation more than comfort. Over the next 6 weeks, we developed the strangest working rhythm of my life. He would posture. I would cut. He would resist. I would explain exactly which buried cost would return to murder the deck later. He'd grumble, then absorb the correction anyway because some part of him already knew the flatter version was weaker. At times, I almost liked him. That was dangerous. Men like Yuhyeon are easiest to forgive right before they begin believing that capable people around them exist naturally for their use. The decisive fight came over a staffing slide. He wanted the overseas initiative to look lean and leadership forward. In practice, that meant compressing support assumptions and letting the local team optimize through effort until reality later forced a correction. Again, a beautiful Hansung tradition. I told him no in a room with only the 2 of us and a dead projector bulb. He looked genuinely offended. You know, most people at your level would try sounding more careful before disagreeing with me. And most people at your level are surrounded by enough careful lies already. He stood, walked to the window and said, "You think because my father notices you now, you can keep talking like you're outside the company." That line mattered, because it showed me where his fear lived. Not in my competence. The possibility that I might remain not his. I answered carefully, "No, I think if you want to survive inside this company without borrowing worse men's judgment, somebody has to tell you when you're building the same trap in nicer fonts." That was the first conversation where he did not come back with sarcasm. He looked at the staffing page again. Then he said, quieter, "And if I don't want to be handled like a symbol, then stop asking the room to love the symbol more than the work." That landed. Not beautifully. Deeply. He reworked the staffing plan himself after that. Worse language than mine, better logic than before. Progress. Those were the kind of changes I couldn't measure on a quarterly sheet. Still, they mattered. Companies don't transform because of one heroic speech. They shift because enough future decision-makers get corrected before their worst instincts become doctrine. The ethics review months later nearly undid all that progress because it tempted me into the oldest version of myself, the effective one, the one who knows which knife to hand which man and how far to let him cut before pulling him back. Kang needed ammunition on O. I had it. Seo needed saving. Jinhwan needed not to become the clean name on a dirty chain. Everything in the room pointed toward the same answer: use one predator to stop another. I did it. It worked. And afterward I felt the old part of me wake up. Not guilt, worse, ease. That is the real danger of getting good at company war. Not that it hurts, that it stops hurting fast enough. I noticed it the same night because I was on the train back from the office and found myself thinking, efficiently, about what else Kang could be useful for if handled properly. Not whether he should be. How? Smooth. Already adapted. That scared me more than any vice president ever had. So I got off 2 stations early, walked without direction for 40 minutes, and called my mother from a convenience store parking lot because I needed a voice not paid by the company's logic. She answered on the second ring and said, "You sound like you won something you didn't want to become good at." That was exactly it. I stood under bad white light with a paper cup of coffee cooling in my hand and said, "How do you know when the thing you used to survive is also changing what survives in you?" She was quiet a moment. "Then, when you start talking about people like tools after midnight." I looked at the coffee, at the trucks on the road, at my own reflection in the store glass. I didn't say tools. You didn't have to. That ended the ease. Not the work. The ease. Good. The second life was never going to stay clean. That was fantasy. What I needed was friction. Places where the language rubbed hard enough against something living that it couldn't fully become doctrine again. My mother, Jinhwan, Minjiang, sometimes Seo, when he was tired enough to tell the truth without armor. Those were the friction points. The company would keep trying to polish me into something elegant and terrible. I just had to keep making sure the polishing cloth hit bone before it mistook me for finished metal. Project Meridian opened the whole company up like a living anatomy chart. Not publicly, not at first. The public saw only minor reshuffles, talk about efficiency, leadership development, growth alignment, the usual perfume. Inside the file, though, Meridian was the real map. Which divisions would matter in 5 years, which lines would be strengthened, which executives would be aged upward with honor and which would be hollowed out into advisors once the company had taken the useful parts, which younger managers had enough responsiveness to accelerate, which had too much independent judgment to trust without a stronger leash. I saw my own name in that file and almost laughed. High volatility, emerging talent. Unusual upward responsiveness. Low institutional predictability. No one had ever described me so accurately and so insultingly in one line. More importantly, I saw Jinhwan's projected path toward the exact audit-gray hell division that later taught him to mistake exhaustion for duty. I saw Minjiang's line cap 2 promotions too low because a less capable man needed clear air above her. I saw CO marked as stabilizing senior labor, valuable but potentially overfixed in current function, a sentence built to keep truthful men useful until their health makes them movable. Meridian wasn't just strategy. It was future pain budgeted early. That was when the chairman asked the real question over dinner. How do you test whether a potentially disruptive leader can carry more than projects? By giving him people, I said. I knew what I was doing when I said it. I just didn't know how fast Hansung would take the offer. The special improvement cell they gave me next was small enough to be deniable and dirty enough to be real. Consumer systems recovery, 1 failing air purifier line, 3 direct reports, 1 dotted line service analyst, limited budget, unlimited exposure, which meant the cell carried all the ingredients of a normal company burial pit and one dangerous possibility. Because no one important believed the project worth prestige, I had room to solve the actual problem. The team came pre-damaged. Higher-in, junior planner, good enough to be overused and quiet enough that everyone above her confused that with consent. Sangwoo from channel support, older than me, already halfway convinced his transfer meant the company had found a nicer room in which to forget him. Sujin from service, officially undertitled and unofficially one of the few people in Hansung who knew what customer shame sounded like over the phone. I opened our first meeting by telling them the truth. This is probably a dead-end project, I said. The good news is dead-end projects get watched less carefully from above. That means we can solve the real problem as long as the numbers improve fast enough to shut people up. Silence. Then Sujin asked, and when they take credit? We make sure the path is documented before they do. That was enough for the room to start breathing differently. Product line was failing in an especially corporate way. The purifier itself mostly worked. The problem was that the company had built a maintenance cycle that made ordinary customers feel stupid in their own homes, then asked service agents to explain the failure with scripts that sounded like blame. Product called it acceptable consumer misuse. Sales called it retailer education drift. Marketing called it maintenance communication. Service called it Tuesday. Sujin was the one who named the real thing. It's not complexity, she said one evening with a stack of call summaries in front of her. It's shame. Customers don't understand the filter cycle, performance drops, they feel fooled, and by the time they call they're already angry because the machine made them feel incompetent. That changed the whole project. We weren't fixing a product line. We were repairing dignity damage. So I rebuilt the strategy around that. Better reminder cycle. Simpler indicator. Retail packaging that normalized maintenance instead of hiding it. Service scripts rewritten to remove blame. Branch swap authority in the early high-anger complaint ban, so the brand bought back trust before resentment became folklore. The division heads hated the first draft exactly the way weak structures always hate truth. Product said redesign implied prior design weakness. Sales said swap authority would invite abuse. Finance said the cost looked indulgent. Marketing worried that maintenance clarity would hurt premium feel. I let them talk. Then I played them the calls. A woman from Ilsen saying she had paid too much money to feel stupid in her own house. A young father apologizing to service because he thought he must have used the machine wrong. An older customer asking if she was too old to own the purifier properly. No slide could have done what those voices did. The room changed. Not because those men suddenly grew souls. Because they could no longer pretend the failure was abstract. We won most of the plan. Not all. Enough. And then the real test arrived. What happened to my people after the numbers improved? The company's answer, of course, was headcount review. Temporary contracts first. Support admin next. Dead-end projects rationalized after that. Meaning Hyeren was still at risk despite carrying half the data discipline of the room. Sujin could easily be absorbed back into disposable script work once her truth had been harvested into a division win. Sangwoo could get dumped into another quiet corridor the second his field knowledge stopped being fashionable in meetings. The old me would have protected the project and called the rest unfortunate. This time I took the staffing list to Kang and forced the issue. If the company keeps the result and throws away the people who made the real correction possible, I told him, then it teaches everyone watching that truth only matters after someone above them can wear it. He asked whether I was trying to shame the organization into maturity. I told him no. I was pricing it into better behavior. That got all 3 lines moved enough to matter. Hyeren's classification was corrected and her contract converted. Sujin was moved into product-service integration, where her field voice couldn't be buried as easily. Sangwoo landed in a regional optimization role under a director who actually signed his own errors, which at Hansung counted as near-mythical civilization. 3 people. No applause. Still one of the purest wins in the whole part. And because life in large companies likes irony, that was the exact moment Vice President O finally saw the real danger in me. Not that I was ambitious. Plenty of young men are ambitious. Not that I was effective. He had seen that already. That I might actually start proving that results and human protection were not opposites by default. Men like O depend on organizations believing the opposite. It is their whole religion. He stopped me in the corridor one evening and said, "You're beginning to confuse benevolent management with strategic capability." I bowed just enough to stay employed. "Then it's fortunate the numbers improved too, sir." He looked at me with the cold recognition older predators reserve for younger ones who have finally stopped asking to be judged by kind standards. "Careful," he said. "The people who insist they're different from the company usually become its best advertisement." That line went into me like a splinter. Because he wasn't fully wrong. Difference can become branding. Conscience can become style. Protecting a few people can become the emotional luxury you use to forgive yourself for climbing inside the same machine. So I carried that warning forward too. The company would keep asking what I was becoming. Fine. I would keep asking too. The deputy manager acceleration review and the external offer hit in the same week, which felt almost too symmetrical until I remembered Hansung had always loved testing a man's loyalties right when his title started to outrun his age. The review room was cramped, formal, and built to make people at my level feel that their future depended on furniture chosen by someone richer and more tired. HR, planning executive, operations director, CEO in an advisory chair, one empty place for the chairman's legal aid because dread is more effective if people have time to imagine the shoes walking in. The questions look standard. Track record, leadership, risk control, organizational adaptability. Then came the real one. How do you distinguish healthy intervention from personal overreach? Not achievement. Obedience. I gave them the truest corporate answer I had. If the intervention clarifies hidden cost and makes the system better able to bear truth, it's healthy. If it only protects one actor's comfort while exporting damage downward, it's overreach wearing better grammar. That answer followed me straight into lunch with Jin Tiwoo. He called as if we already had a history, which in one life we did. In this one we only had recognition. That was enough. He met me at a quiet place near City Hall, ordered before I sat down, and made the offer cleanly. Faster rise, better pay, wider strategic platform, less family gravity than Hansung, more room to become dangerous before someone tried to classify me into usefulness and sedate the edges. It was a good offer because parts of it were true. I still said no. Not because Hansung deserved loyalty. Because I still had too much unfinished surgery inside it. Tiwoo accepted the refusal in the worst possible way, with interest instead of offense. Then at least become expensive enough that they regret every year they underestimated you, he said. I told him that sounded like something a future trader would say charmingly over lunch. He laughed, which, annoyingly, made me like him in exactly the direction I shouldn't. The acceleration result arrived 2 days later. Approved. Deputy Manager track accelerated by 1 cycle. Pending sustained strategic contribution. That phrase, pending sustained strategic contribution, contained all the company's affection and threat in one tidy envelope. Congratulations. Now prove it longer. Again, under new weather. I took the envelope to the pantry where Minjiang was bullying a dead vending machine with a pen. She read the line once and asked, "Do you feel happy?" No one else would have asked that. Everyone else would have asked if it meant more power. I thought about it and answered honestly. Not happy, clearer. She nodded as if that was the only sane response. Good. Happiness is unstable in this building. Clarity travels better. That same month, the chairman's office drew me into a working dinner on long-cycle organizational design. Chairman Han, Seungmin, Kang, CEO, 2 outside advisors, food too refined to trust, air too still to waste on anything unserious. One hypothetical took over the table. If 2 future leaders show equal strategic potential, but one is smoother and the other more disruptive while often correct, who should the company accelerate? The advisors talked like columnists with pensions. Kang talked like a man pricing heat. CEO talked like he was trying to prevent future funerals without using the word future. Seungmin said a company this size cannot afford unstable centers. Then the chairman looked at me. I said the company should not decide between smooth and disruptive first. It should ask whether either man can make hard truth travel upward without turning every room into a personal event. And if it wants to test that, it should give him responsibility for people, not just projects. I knew as I said it that I was volunteering. The company took the offer. Of course it did. The special improvement cell became the first small proof that I could do more than rescue projects. I could shape a room, hold people under pressure, and keep the company from eating the exact kinds of employees it later claimed were impossible to find. That mattered more than the title line ever did. Then the chairman put the next measure on me. Organizational planning. Not immediately. Next cycle. After quarter close. Still close enough to feel the altitude change. CEO told me that was where the company wrote its future excuses. I told him that was exactly why I wanted in. He said, good, better to send someone who could smell excuses while the ink was still wet. He was right. By then I understood the next stage clearly. The first part of the second life had been about catching the known disasters early. Saving Jinhwan before usefulness turned suicidal. Protecting my mother from the version of me that always came home, already half-claimed by the office. Meeting Minjiang early enough to let respect become discipline instead of tragedy. Keeping CEO from becoming a better, sicker machine too soon. Stopping plants, products, and files from turning into the same future wreckage under different cover names. The next part was going to be harder. Not rescuing moments. Shaping environments. Meaning I would move from the level where you can still point to one line, one decision, one wrong report and say that's where the damage began, into the level where damage gets dispersed early enough to feel strategic instead of cruel. That is where men either become builders or polished accomplices. The company, of course, tried to blur the difference immediately. There was one last small logistics scandal before year-end. A supplier's nephew, a false customs clarification, a shipment discrepancy small enough to hide under variance and large enough to prove that family rot still ran through every polished hallway in the company. The old me would have treated it as another wind to root upward. This time I mapped the room first. Legal, CEO, Kang, Seungmin, the right sequence, the right witness path, the right cost. No speech. No stunt. Just pressure correctly arranged. The nephew vanished from 3 committees in 2 days. Oh, lost another inch of air. Seungmin learned another ugly lesson about what happens when lineage and carelessness share a corridor too long. And I got the final note confirming the move. Deputy Manager track locked. Organizational planning after quarter close. I took the note to the roof. Of course I did. Some habits are rituals because they carry their own witness. Hot wind. Cheap coffee. Jinhwan beside me again, alive, irritated, proud in the blunt way only real friends ever manage. You should say something dramatic, he said after reading the note. Why? Because this is the part in other people's lives where they say they knew they would make it. I looked at the skyline, at the note, at his face, and said the truest version available. I did know, I said. I just didn't know whether I could get here without becoming someone I'd hate later. He was quiet for a second, then he nodded and said, and now I'm close enough to find out for real. That was the ending point. Not victory. Altitude. I had changed the slope of the climb, saved the first people, refused the first old lies, entered the chairman's sight line without surrendering my language completely. The company still wanted to use me. Good. I still wanted to use the company back. When I folded the note and put it in my pocket, the mission was cleaner than it had ever been in the first life. Go high enough that they can't keep pretending they don't know what they build with other people's lives. That sounds like ambition. It is. It also sounds, for the first time, like something I might actually be able to live with when the cameras flash again later. And this time, if I ever stood under that applause at the top, I intended to know exactly whose voices I had not buried to get there. After that first long climb, the company stopped testing me only through flagship projects and started testing whether I could stay accurate during the small daily rot that actually teaches most managers who they are. The year-end sales review on the 12th floor was a good example. A branch manager from Busan finally admitted the premium line was moving through whispered discounting the official reports never acknowledged. Finance tried to frame it as local improvisation. Sales wanted the issue buried until January. I forced them to compare invoice timing against in-store replacement requests, and the whole thing stopped being field atmosphere and became exactly what it was: prestige protected by making retailers do the embarrassing part in private. Jinhwan read the numbers once and said the company was outsourcing shame again. Kang hated the phrasing and used the logic anyway. That combination happened more often than he liked to admit. Most useful lessons arrived outside headquarters too. In Daegu, I watched 2 sales reps train store staff to skip the maintenance explanation entirely because customers wanted confidence, not instruction. At the time it sounded like ordinary branch nonsense. It was. It was the same old Hansung instinct in miniature. Sell reassurance now. Let the service line absorb the humiliation later. I made the reps listen to complaint recordings in front of the store team. No slogans, no lecture, just the actual voices of customers who had been made to feel foolish in their own kitchens and living rooms. The room changed after that. People learn ethics badly through posters and surprisingly well through embarrassment placed at the right angle. Other battles were quieter. One late-night file war in the records annex started with a customs clarification using 2 different handwriting rhythms in the same approval block. Legal wanted to call it sloppiness. Procurement called it urgency. I lined the timestamps up, proved the clarification had been written after the shipment moved, and handed the sequence upward before anybody could tidy the language. Another day my mother asked me to accompany her to a routine clinic visit, and over noodles afterward she asked whether I was protecting her health or trying to forgive myself in advance for a future I still remembered too clearly. Then there was the dinner with the Japanese buyers, where one of them quietly signaled that Hansung's promises sounded smoother than its delivery rhythm. I cut the scripted reassurance down to a smaller promise we could actually keep. Kang didn't thank me, but he stopped editing my caution notes for tone after that. With him, that counted as applause. Hardest rescues usually involve people I loved enough to mismanage. One night I found Jinhwan on the emergency stair behind Building 3 with a stack of reconciliations on his lap and the exact posture he used to wear before real damage. He said he was only tired. I took half the file, called Choi directly, and told him if he wanted the quarter closed with both accuracy and living staff, he had to choose one place to stop being proud. Choi swore at me for a full minute and then did the right thing anyway. Around the same season, Jinhwan rehearsed a brutal board correction pitch in a dead little presentation room that smelled like markers and resentment. I played the worst version of the audience until her language came out sharp enough that even hostile men would have to meet the actual argument instead of the temperature of her voice. Some memories refused to stay symbolic. Dawn in the Ulsan control office after the flood still smelled of rust and panic, and the local management chain was already trying to revise the timeline into something survivable. I handed the incident draft back with 4 lines crossed out and told the plant director to decide whether he wanted an accurate morning or an ugly spring, because he was not getting both. Different kind of filth surfaced through rumor. One manager hinted my rise had to come from private sponsorship, because actual work was apparently too plain an explanation for his comfort. I answered the only way worth answering in companies like ours, and sent the cleanest correction memo of the quarter through his line before lunch. Later, in a branch training room in Incheon, Sujin and I forced sales staff to hear their own script the way a customer would hear it after the product disappointed them. People talk about culture as if it's abstract. Usually it's just repetition with authority behind it. By the time winter closed over Seoul again, the whole shape of the second life had become clearer than it had ever been in the first. The old version of me climbed by absorbing the company's logic and using it better than the men who had inherited smoother paths. That strategy worked. It got me all the way to the top and left almost nothing human around me worth carrying there. The new version was doing something harder and slower. I was still climbing, still ambitious, still willing to enter dirty rooms and come out with blood on the file if that was the price of changing the sequence before the damage settled. But now every rise came with a second question attached. What happens to the people near me if I win this one the company's way? That question changed everything. It changed how I read staffing notes, because a division move was never just a division move again. It changed how I built strategy, because every efficiency line had a body hidden under it somewhere. It changed how I handled Jinhwan, because usefulness without self-defense is just preloaded grief. It changed how I listened to Minjeong, because standing beside someone strong and stepping in front of them are not the same form of care. It changed how I answered the chairman, because once you hear men like him speak their real religion out loud, every clean corporate word starts casting a longer shadow. I did not become kinder. That would have been too easy to fake. I became less willing to let the company name cruelty for me. Hansung still wanted what it had always wanted. Results without residue. Loyalty without inconvenience. Speed without witness. Leadership without the trouble of people remaining fully real beneath it. Too bad. I had already lived through the version of the story where that worked. Now I was high enough to interfere. Not at the top yet. Not even close. Close enough that rooms had to answer when I spoke. Close enough that some younger employees had started looking at me the way I once looked at directors, trying to decide whether there was a future under that line or only a cleaner version of obedience. That responsibility frightened me more than any vice president ever had. Good. Fear of people is healthier than fear of power. It means you still understand where consequences really land. The file confirming my move toward organizational planning sat in my drawer for 3 days before I took it home. Not because I doubted it, because I wanted to choose the moment it became part of the rest of my life instead of just the company's. On the 4th night, I brought it to my mother. She read it once, set it on the table beside the soup and said, "You look proud." "I am." "You also look worried." "I am." She nodded like those two things belonged together naturally. Maybe they did. "Good," she said. "The day success stops worrying you is the day it starts owning more of you than it should." Then she fed me, asked about the people on the new floor instead of the title, and made me promise I would not begin calling every family dinner difficult to schedule like men who think promotions replace relatives. After that I called Jinhwan and told him the news. He swore loudly enough that his mother in the background asked what had broken. He said, "Everything if you turn into an executive before 30. I told him I planned to become one only in the technical sense. He said that was somehow worse. Then I called Minjeong. She listened, quiet, no fake surprise, then said, "Organizational planning means the company is done testing whether you can fix problems and is ready to see whether you'll help design them." That's not a congratulation. It's a useful one. I leaned against the wall with the phone at my ear and smiled despite myself. "And if I refuse?" "You won't refuse. You'll go in, get angry, and try to make the machine more honest than it likes, which is why I'm still taking your calls." That felt dangerously close to tenderness. So I changed the subject and asked about her own promotion line. She told me not to ruin the moment by being decent in a clumsy way. Again, useful. The last thing I did before closing that first enormous part of the second life was go back to the roof. Same bad coffee. Same city. Same hot wind or cold air, depending on the month. Different spine. When I stood there now, I was no longer the newly rewound rookie shaking with shock under fluorescent lights. I was no longer only the assistant manager throwing himself into rooms before older men could name the danger small enough to survive it. I had become something the first life had reached too late, and the second had shaped much earlier. A man the company had to calculate around. Good. That was all I had ever really wanted from the rewind. Not magic. Not comfort. Leverage before rot. Far below, the city kept moving with its ordinary cruelty. People hurrying home. People staying late in buildings that would call them committed while they aged under strip lights. Trucks moving parts between factories. Mothers waiting for sons to call. Good women doing stronger work than the men credited over them. Honest men signing papers they should have been taught to fear. Whole future's changing because one manager chose convenience over witness at 9:40 on a Tuesday, and nobody important looked closely enough until after the damage got a press line. I looked out at all of it and finally admitted the second life's real shape without needing to protect myself from the sound. I was still climbing to the top. I just wasn't climbing there to belong to them anymore. This time I was climbing high enough to decide which parts of the company got to keep pretending they were inevitable, and which parts had to finally answer for what they built with other people's lives. And that, for the first time, felt like a future worth getting to before the applause. Organizational planning lived one floor higher than strategy and one moral layer lower. That was my first conclusion after a week. Strategy still dealt in arguments, market timing, acquisitions, exposure, crisis language, ugly work but visible. Organizational planning dealt in quieter violence. Headcount grids, division weighting, promotion tracks, succession lines, role design, budget posture disguised as culture, and every elegant sentence companies use when they want to move 10 people without letting the 11th understand what it says about him. Strategy tells the market what the company wants to do. Organizational planning tells the company which human beings must become flexible enough to let it happen. I loved the floor immediately. I distrusted myself for that. Both reactions were reasonable. My direct lead there was Director Na, one of those men who look too soft for their own rank until you realize the softness is just a better sheath. He had rounded shoulders, dry humor, and the kind of voice that never rose because it did not need to. In my first life, he never really noticed me until I was already too far gone into executive grammar to surprise him. This time I met him while I still had enough friction left to be difficult. He welcomed me by sliding a stack of division redesign sheets across the desk and saying, "Most people come here wanting to move boxes on paper. The job is actually deciding which boxes eventually become divorces." That got my attention in a way no corporate pep talk ever could. You always explain things like that to younger staff. Only the ones I suspect might be arrogant enough to survive hearing it. Good, we were speaking the same dialect already. First month on the new floor taught me two important things. One, organizational planning attracted a specific kind of talent, people smart enough to see the whole company and emotionally detached enough to treat that vision like weather. Two, I was no longer unusual because I saw systems. I was unusual because I still let the systems lead me back to individual faces. That was an advantage, also a risk. Too much face in a planning room and everyone assumes you're sentimental. Too little and you wake up at 42 with a CEO title and a funeral line where your actual life should be. My analyst support there came in the form of two people the company had already started underestimating in different directions. Kim Jinhwan, 26, top of her training cohort, excellent with workforce modeling, already being described as slightly too sharp by men who had survived 10 years on mediocrity and hierarchy. And Park Dongmin, older than both of us, former operations liaison with a slow-speaking style that executives kept mistaking for slowness, until his questions exposed that he had read more of the file than they had. The company had no shortage of intelligent people. It had a shortage of room where intelligence did not immediately get turned into decorative obedience. So I built that room first. Not through speeches. Through assignment design. Jinhwan got authority over the analytical spine of the first divisional headcount review instead of being told to support it. Dongmin got direct meeting presence in two cross-floor sessions where men above him had previously used his work without letting him hear how they distorted it. And I made one rule clear on day one. If you disagree, I told them, disagree while the page is still wet. After the paper leaves this room, disagreement costs more and helps less. Jinhwan looked at me as if she had been waiting 3 years to hear somebody say that without joking. Dongmin just nodded once and said, "Then we should probably start disagreeing immediately." Good. Exactly right. The first major file was a regional consolidation plan for consumer appliance support. Clean title. Filthy reality. Hansung wanted to centralize support functions in 3 regions, close 2 smaller local planning hubs, and reallocate staff into future growth positions. I had seen the future version already. One of those growth positions later became a dead corridor where decent managers were turned into invisible variance absorbers until their marriages, health, or confidence caved in first. The plan looked efficient if you only cared about salary weight and reporting span. It looked predatory if you cared what actually happened after the move. The danger sat in the assumptions. Every regional manager had been modeled as interchangeable labor. Family ties, local market knowledge, supplier history, school year timing for forced relocation. None of it counted because the model wanted smoothness. Smoothness is just cruelty wearing math when you don't question the variables early enough. I questioned them, not with outrage, with cost, travel time inflation, local relationship loss, error drag from new handover, early resignation probability among high-integrity middle managers given forced transfer language, customer escalation lag if branch knowledge gets moved into centralized team pools. The room hated that model because it made neat savings look less neat. Good. Director now read the first pass and said, "You're still trying to rescue people with numbers." "No," I said. "I'm trying to stop people from pretending the numbers don't already contain them." That earned me one dry nod and a second pass instead of a lecture. The conflict rose all the way to Sume inside of Meridian, because one of the hubs marked for closure supported a region linked to a donor-backed appliance service initiative, which meant, of course, that actual efficiency suddenly mattered less than who got embarrassed by the redesign and when. Meetings multiplied. Files thickened. Language got polished until the whole thing looked like a cultural realignment exercise instead of a geographic body sorting. That was when Jinhwan proved herself. One afternoon in a room full of men too senior to enjoy being contradicted by someone whose title still fit under assistant manager, she said, very calmly, "Your retention model assumes everyone who stays after forced relocation keeps producing at baseline. That only works if you believe humans are office chairs." You could have heard a paper cut. The operational vice director across from her tried the usual thing. Young staff often mistake ideal conditions for actual business constraints. She didn't blink. "No, sir, I'm saying your constraint model has mistaken burnout for free continuity." I nearly smiled. That was the exact type of line the company punishes and remembers at the same time. Dangerous, necessary, mine too if I didn't let her get eaten for it. I backed the model before anyone could isolate her sentence as youthful excess. Dongman supported from the field side with branch attrition history. Director Na stepped in last with the official weight. The closure plan didn't die. It changed. 2 hubs instead of 3, phased movement instead of immediate displacement, local knowledge retention tied to actual staff choice instead of fake internal mobility theater. Not enough. Much better than the original body count. After the meeting, Ji-woon shut the conference door behind us and asked, "Was that too much?" "No," I said. "It was too accurate in a room built to prefer decorum over math." "That sounds like a yes with better tailoring." "It means next time phrase it half a degree colder, and you'll keep all the force with less room for them to call it youth." She thought about that, then nodded, "Got it." That was the real management test, not whether I could be right, whether I could make someone else sharper without turning her into a more obedient version of me. I was still learning. The offer from outside did not leave after the lunch. Men like Jin Tiwoo never throw a net only once if they think the fish is learning the current. He resurfaced through a joint supplier dinner in late 2004 when Hansung and his group both started circling the same second-tier display materials company. The formal reason for the dinner was market alignment. The real reason was reconnaissance. Who looked hungry? Who looked impatient? Who could be made to talk bigger than the room without noticing the cost? Tiwoo was very good at that. So was I by then, which made the whole evening feel less like business and more like fencing with cutlery between courses. He asked me, halfway through the second bottle of acceptable wine nobody there was actually enjoying, whether Hansung was finally giving me enough room to become dangerous or still just enough rope to become useful. I told him his questions were getting more expensive. He said so was I. And Jiang, seated 2 places down, pretended not to listen and later asked in the elevator whether all rival strategists flirted with destruction that openly or whether Tiwoo was just one of the special cases. I told her the polite answer was all. The honest one was the smart ones never bother hiding their appetite from people they think might share it. She studied me for half a second too long after that and said, "Good. Then keep yours visible enough that it doesn't start dressing up as virtue." Again useful. Again irritating. Whose second offer came in better clothing. Not an exit, a collaboration, off-record review work on East Asian supplier exposures, paid through an outside strategic circle that officially did not yet exist and unofficially already had enough money behind it to buy patience from 3 future vice presidents. The money was tempting, the information access more so. In another life I might have taken that sort of side line and told myself it was merely prudent diversification. In this one I saw the deeper danger. The more chairs you sit in before director line, the easier it becomes to tell yourself loyalty is childish and conviction a negotiable asset. So I refused again. More politely. No less clearly. He laughed and said, "You're either very disciplined or you've finally fallen in love with the battlefield itself." I said, "I'm not done with the war I already chose." He accepted that too easily, which meant he intended to keep waiting. The outside pressure still helped me, though. Kang noticed. Of course he did. He was one of the few men in Hansung who understood that an employee only becomes truly valuable once somebody else has tried to price him too. He called me into his office the week after the supplier dinner and asked, without any corridor softening, "How many times have you said no to people who think you should leave?" I said, "Enough that the people inside should probably ask why." That got me another of his almost smiles. "And why haven't you?" "Because the company still owed too many people the future I meant to steal back. Because I wanted the top without the same body count. Because I had not come back 20 years to turn my own conscience into consulting. Because if I left too early, the company would simply continue teaching the next bright young man the same polished cruelty and call it executive maturation. Instead I said, because Hansung is where the map still matters." He let that sit and then told me something more honest than I expected from him. "The company notices outside interest. That makes you harder to move quietly, which is useful. It also makes some people more eager to test whether your loyalty is real or merely delayed negotiation." Meaning? Meaning stop assuming every next assignment is only about the file. He was right again. I hated how often that happened. The new test arrived in December through Yuhyeon. Wanted me attached to a cross-company education program for future executive candidates. On paper, flattering, exposure, leadership grooming, broader perspective. In reality, it was a holding pen for ambitious sons, useful daughters, and select younger managers the company wanted to observe in semi-domesticated conditions before deciding who among them could be shaped upward without future scandal. Yuhyeon sold it as a chance. Kang called it a zoo with better catering. Director Na told me to go because you learn more watching heirs pretend collaboration than you ever will from a polished annual report. The program itself took place over 3 weekends in a training center outside Yongan. Simulated cases, cross-division workshops, fabricated crisis rooms, the usual nonsense, which meant the real value wasn't in the exercises. It was in the informal movement around them, who gathered after sessions, who avoided whom, which senior facilitators treated certain participants as already spoken for, which randomly assigned. Breakout groups kept placing me beside specific succession line people. By the second weekend, I understood the structure. They were not evaluating whether I could contribute. They were evaluating whether I would align. The first direct pressure came through a fabricated labor crisis case, which would have been funny if it weren't so close to the real graves I still carried. The model scenario described a regional plant slowdown tied to local wage dissatisfaction and delayed maintenance spending. 3 candidate responses were laid out. 1 cost-focused, 1 messaging-focused, 1 hybrid, all bad in different ways. The facilitator, a smiling executive from HR who had definitely never stood on a wet factory floor at 2 a.m., asked for my recommendation. I said the scenario was dishonest. The room went still. He smiled the way well-paid trainers do when they think candor is just another kind of performative energy they can file under passion. How so? You've separated labor trust, maintenance neglect, and public communication into 3 categories for the exercise, I said. In the real plant, they'd already be 1 problem by the time this room was assembled. Any answer built on the split is only choosing which lie to tell first. A girl from Heavy Components actually looked relieved, which told me she'd read the scenario properly too and was tired of pretending. Yuhyeon did not look relieved. He looked interested in that narrowed way he wore whenever I became more useful and less manageable at the same time. The facilitator tried to reclaim the frame, for the purposes of the exercise. "No," I said, "for the purposes of the company. If you train future leaders to think these problems arrive neatly separated, then the only thing they'll learn is how to apologize in better sequencing." That phrase traveled. I knew it the second I said it. Some lines don't need minutes. They become corridor property on contact. By dinner the same night 2 participants had already repeated it with different smiles. By the following week it had reached Kang, who called me in and said, "Try not to become famous for truth before you've secured enough authority to survive being quoted." Advice, warning, almost care. I took all 3. My first real management failure in the second life happened. because I moved too fast for someone else's pride and called it efficiency in my own head. The file was small. That was the trap. A redesigned support packet for the purifier line had to move through product, service, and consumer sales before quarter close. Yuhyeon had built the analysis spine beautifully. Sujin had added the customer-side correction notes. Sangwoo had cleaned the branch implementation grid enough that even finance couldn't pretend not to understand it. The room was ready. The file was right. And because I already knew how often Hansung killed momentum through delay theater, I routed the packet directly to the director review line instead of letting one intermediate manager massage it first. The packet won. That part worked. The problem was that I bypassed Sujin's immediate supervisor without warning and effectively told a woman who had spent 6 years under a system of polite invisibility that I had solved the politics for her faster than she could prepare her own footing. The supervisor got embarrassed, lashed downward, and Sujin took the first impact before I even knew the echo had hit. She came into my office the next morning looking angrier than I had ever seen her, set the return packet on my desk, and said, "Do not save me like that again." I blinked. What happened? What happened, she said very clearly, is that you moved the work before I could decide how to manage the person whose signature sits between me and the room you wanted. The packet won. My week lost. Those are not the same result. That stung because it was right. Again, the second life kept humiliating me in exactly the directions I deserved. I apologized immediately. No explanation. No, I was just trying. Just apology. Then I asked how to repair it. She stared, maybe surprised I'd gone there first, then told me exactly how. Not to smooth her supervisor, not to perform loyalty, to create visibility for the contribution in a way that left the supervisor no clean excuse to retaliate without looking petty. In other words, build the credit architecture better next time. So we did. I reissued the next review through the proper chain, but built the support notes so clearly around named contribution that anyone trying to strip Sujin's role out would have to do it in writing. Yuhyeon and I aligned the technical appendix so her logic was inseparable from the correction path. Sangwoo backed implementation timing in a way that tied all three names together under the same outcome. The supervisor still disliked it. Too bad. He now had to dislike it under traceable light. After the second packet cleared, Sujin stood by my desk, arms folded, and said, "Better." That's all. That's a lot from me. Fair. The lesson mattered more than the packet. The company trains upward men especially to confuse speed with authority. Move fast, solve, carry, decide. If you're good enough, people applaud the efficiency and call you leadership material. The trap is that speed lets you step over other people's agency while still believing you're rescuing the outcome. That is just another form of executive carelessness with nicer shoes. I wrote that down later in my private notebook. Not because I wanted a moral diary. Because I knew the higher I got, the easier it would become to repeat the error at scale. The notebook had become a real thing by then. Small black cover. No company logo. Kept in the second drawer under old budget templates because nobody at Hansung ever opens a drawer that looks boring enough to contain work. I did not write every day. Only when I noticed the company had taught me a phrase or reflex I wanted to remember to fight later. A few entries from that winter. Never let smooth become your favorite compliment in a planning room. If a problem gets solved faster than the person living under it can process, check whether you've only shifted the pain one level down. When older men call someone promising, ask promising for what? Useful is not always a neutral word. Every room has a cost model. Learn who is in it before you mistake approval for safety. If you can't explain the project without hiding one person's injury under abstraction, the abstraction is the real document. Maybe that sounds obsessive. It was. Good. Obsession at least has the decency to admit it wants control. The notebook saved me again in the spring when organizational planning tried to turn high-potential leadership calibration into an excuse for gutting the very regional autonomy that had kept 2 consumer lines from collapsing the previous winter. The plan was clever enough to fool most people above director rank. Give high-performing younger managers broader rotational tracks, centralized decision rights for consistency, and tell the branches they would now benefit from direct strategic support. In reality, it was a purity move, more control upward, less reality flowing back, more clean dashboards, more room for mid-level panic to turn into local harm before soul ever smelled it. I might have missed it in the old life, because at that point I still believed centralization usually meant competence. In the second, I knew better. Competence and centralization are cousins at best. Sometimes one strangles the other. Director Nu gave me the file because, as he put it, you've become annoying in exactly the way this floor needs when it starts admiring itself too much. I read the model, checked the branch feedback history, and then did something that made half the floor think I had finally become reckless for sport. I built the countermodel with named downstream risks attached by role, not field adaptation loss. I wrote customer escalation delay under sole-managed backlog, not local planning redundancy. I wrote decision gap where no one with authority owns the market truth in time, not manager transfer burden. I wrote forced mobility likely to remove the exact people who know why last winter didn't become public failure. The file looked ugly compared to the official version. Good. Ugly was honest. When the review room complained about tone, I told them the branches were not going to get hurt in sanitized bullet points either. That line got back to King. So did the file. He sent it upward anyway. By then we had an understanding. He would tolerate my unpleasantness if it arrived attached to enough value. I would tolerate his appetite if it still moved the truth through rooms better than the softer liars around him. Not friendship. Not loyalty. A temporary structure of aligned danger. Those are the most stable kind in companies, unfortunately. The year I learned how much Hansung feared honest women was also the year I stopped pretending my feelings for Minjeong were a side issue I could schedule around. This was not because of one confession scene. Nothing that childish. Because of work. Because the company kept putting both of us in rooms where precision mattered and then asking one of us to soften while encouraging the other to sharpen. Once you see that dynamic enough times, attraction stops feeling like romance and starts feeling like recognition under pressure. Much worse. The first clean proof came during a spring brand review for a new small appliance line. The male directors kept interrupting her in ways they did not hear in themselves. Not shouting, not insult. Just the polished upper management habit of treating a woman's finished thought like preliminary material waiting for a heavier voice to complete it. By the third interruption, I was already angry. I did not step in. That was the lesson she had already taught me once. I stood beside, meaning I waited. Then, when the director across from her tried to rephrase her exact point as if he had just independently arrived there, I said, "That's Minjeong's language. Use it correctly or say you're borrowing it." The room paused. He smiled too slowly. She kept going without even glancing at me. Good. That was the right rhythm. Not rescue. Reinforcement. Afterward in the elevator down she said, "Better." I looked at the floor numbers instead of her because if I had looked directly, then I might have smiled too obviously. I'm trainable. No, you're stubborn enough to make learning expensive. That sounds like admiration. That sounds like an invoice. Then the elevator door opened and the moment ended the only way moments in companies ever really do, through someone else's badge and bad timing. Still, it stayed with me all week. So did the second proof. She got sick in June and came to work anyway. Of course she did. Hansung breeds that particular stupidity in all its best people. I knew and I could hear it in her voice. Too even, too controlled. That flattened sound people develop when their body is losing an argument they have no intention of conceding publicly. The old me would have noticed and filed concern away for later because the meeting deck still mattered. The new me put the deck on her desk, told her I would handle the afternoon review and said, "Go home before you turn pneumonia into professionalism." She frowned. "I'm not. You're very obviously something. I can still present. That is not the standard." She looked up then, actually looked, not annoyed, not amused, measuring. "You know," she said, "most men in this company only notice women's health when it threatens a deadline. I'm trying to set a lower bar for hell." That got the smallest exhale out of her. Then she took the medicine packet from her bag, looked at it as if offended by the concept of weakness itself and said, "Fine, but if you ruin my deck rhythm, I'm billing you socially." Accepted. She left. I handled the review. The room lived. She came back the next day with better color in her face and one coffee placed silently on my desk at 8:12. No note. No softness. Perfect. That was when I stopped lying to myself about the direction of the problem. Still, I didn't move on it. How should I? There are attractions you can survive confessing and attractions you should leave alone until the architecture around them stops looking like a collapse risk. We were still two inside the company, two bound into the same pressure system. And I had already learned once what happens when ambition eats marriage and then explains it later using the language of sacrifice. So I did the only responsible thing available. I let the feeling become discipline first. Better work. Better listening. Cleaner honesty. No stepping in front. No using care as a reason to claim more room than she had given me. That did not make it easier. It made it real. The company, naturally, chose that exact season to turn her into a target again. Branding director one line above her decided to build his own future by repackaging the line corrections she had led on 2 product recoveries and presenting them as his division's integrated consumer trust architecture. Even the phrase made me want to drink bleach. Worse, he started sending her revision requests at 11 p.m. framed as collaborative finishing, so the final record would show her as support labor, not author. She knew exactly what he was doing. That was not the problem. The problem was the timing. If she fought too early, he called her territorial. If she waited, he ate the line. So we built the room. Not literally, better. Email chain. Version history. Draft timestamps. Meeting note recap language that preserved origin. 2 side witnesses. 1 route through Kang's office that made the final review impossible to hold without the trackable history attached. It worked. The branding director still got to keep his title. Of course, the company does not punish competent theft unless it becomes too embarrassing to leave uncorrected. But he lost the chance to own the correction cleanly. Her authorship stayed in the line. Her next promotion file carried the work properly. The room did not shift enough to feel noble. It shifted enough to matter. That night after the final review, she stood with me outside the building under light rain and said, "You really do like making rooms harder to lie in." I laughed. I have hobbies. No, hobbies are fun. This is ideology. That word hit harder than she knew. Because she was right. And because the longer I lived the second life, the more I understood that ideology isn't always flags and slogans. Sometimes it's just the shape of harm you refuse to keep calling inevitable. We walked to the station together under one umbrella and said almost nothing after that. Not because there was nothing to say. Because some silences get more honest when you stop trying to turn them into a scene. The train came. She got on first. The doors closed. And for one dangerous second, my whole body wanted to stop being a strategic adult and simply follow the feeling forward wherever it went. I didn't. Good. Not because restraint is nobler. Because timing still matters. I had come back to change a life, not just fall into one more beautifully. The irony, of course, was that trying to do the first cleanly made the second impossible not to feel. By 2005, people below director line had started doing something new around me. They told the truth faster. That was the clearest sign the climb had changed from personal advancement into something heavier. A branch supervisor with a hidden backlog problem stopped by my desk before writing the official report because he wanted to know which parts of the delay would later turn into ammunition if phrased badly. A temporary analyst from finance sent me a variance note privately because she knew the alignment adjustment on the official summary was trying to hide who had really pushed the timing. A service manager from Incheon called me directly and said, "I know this isn't your division anymore, but no one above me wants to hear what this complaint pattern actually means." It wasn't because they trusted me as a hero. It was because they had started calculating that the truth might survive longer if it touched my desk before it touched the decorative chain. That was flattering in exactly the way that becomes corrupting if you don't watch it. So I watched it. I stopped giving private advice that left no paper when the issue truly needed record. I learned to ask one more question before taking someone's side, because urgency is not the same as innocence. I made people own what they knew instead of letting them outsource all their courage into Yuhyeon will fix it. Leadership begins rotting the second it becomes everybody else's excuse, not to stand up in the first room they themselves can still change. Organizational planning taught me that faster than anything else. My first major year there centered on leadership throughput, which sounds like management theory and in practice means, which divisions can we thin, Whom can we stretch? And how elegantly can we explain the resulting pain without saying the board wants cleaner margins before the next investor season? The planned cuts were not mass layoffs. Worse, selective pressure. Remove one mid-level and a regional line here. Merge two support functions there. Freeze a promotion cycle in a unit where everybody is already too tired. Call it developmental elasticity. Watch who breaks quietly. I could read the whole cruelty before the meeting started. What made it harder this time was that I also knew the company was not wrong about every inefficiency. Some lines really were bloated. Some managers really did survive on inherited calm and 20 years of not being challenged by anyone young enough to notice. Not every cut was abuse. That was why these rooms are hard. If all centralization were evil, moral clarity would be cheap. The real fight is in the blended zones, where some reform is necessary and some necessity is simply appetite in formal wear. The file that forced the distinction hardest involved Consumer Sales South and Field Support Central. Merge them badly and you killed branch truth. Leave them untouched and you kept two layers of dead habit no one could justify except through nostalgia and cowardice. I worked the model for 6 days, ran 3 versions, and kept coming back to the same conclusion. The right answer was slower than the room wanted, which meant I had to sell patience in a company addicted to speed theater. Kang hated that on principle. Director Na hated it on schedule. The chairman's legal aide hated it because slow answers make governance look less deliberate. Good. I carried the slower version anyway. Phased merge. Named accountability at each stage. Protected field escalations. No immediate promotion freeze on the surviving line. And one explicit clause preventing reassignment of branch-facing managers into variant sync roles for 12 months after transition. That clause was everything. Without it, the merge became a disguised discard mechanism. With it, the company had to carry its own restructuring honestly long enough for the people doing the real adaptation to remain visible. The room fought me for 40 minutes. I took every hit. Not emotionally. Structurally. If we move faster, where does the unresolved branch truth go? If we merge titles before authority, who signs when the first quarter error spikes? If we freeze the surviving line's promotion path, what exactly are we telling the people we need most to retain? By the end, the legal aid had stopped arguing principle and started asking timeline. That is how you know you've moved the room. Not when they agree with your ethics. When they start budgeting for your reality. Afterward, Director Na walked beside me to the elevator and said, "You know why you're irritating? I have a growing list. You keep making slower answers sound more expensive to ignore than quick violence." I pressed the button. That's because quick violence usually is more expensive. It just sends the invoice later. He made a sound that was either agreement or fatigue. With him, the distinction was often decorative. The merged line held. Messily. Honestly enough. 3 people kept roles they would have lost under the first proposal. One branch manager later told me that clause alone saved his team from being optimized into deafness. He meant it as a joke. He was right anyway. The company rewarded me for that work, exactly the way companies do when they can't decide whether they admire or fear the method. More access. No comfort. I was given partial oversight on a leadership throughput subgrid and a wider voice in next cycle talent mapping, but no one above me started pretending I was safe. In fact, I could feel the opposite. The more consistently I proved that people protection and strategic value were not mutually exclusive, the more dangerous I became to men whose entire careers depended on everyone believing the opposite. Vice President O made that explicit at a year-end reception, of all places. He stopped by my table with a whiskey glass and that polished face of a man who had survived too long on inherited certainty, then said, "You're building quite a reputation." "That sounds almost kind, sir." "It is," he sipped once. "Younger managers have started saying your name when they mean the company can be made to hear things earlier than it prefers. That sort of mythology becomes inconvenient." I set my own glass down because alcohol in those rooms mostly exists to make dishonesty feel social. Then the company should stop rewarding inconvenience only after it has become visible damage. He smiled thinly. "One day you'll understand that systems need myth more than truth." "No," I said, "systems need people to believe that." That ended the conversation. Also not the war. Good. I was getting tired of wars that ended too neatly anyway. After that, the pattern kept surfacing in smaller rooms. One supplier reconciliation brunch exposed how quickly otherwise respectable managers will rename a missed target into timing variance if no one forces the sequence back into active language. A miserable Tuesday in the carrier unit gave me the same lesson from the opposite side. One channel head tried to pass a failed incentive push-off as regional preference divergence until I made him line the inventory map-up with the rebate timing. The jargon died almost immediately after that. It usually does when you put a lie in the same room as its own arithmetic. The branch-level versions were uglier because they sounded more ordinary. 3 supervisors from the South Coast admitted they had started withholding soft customer complaints because Seoul only reacted to fires, never smoke. In the old service archive, Sujin found written letters that had never entered the digital complaint index because someone years ago had decided embarrassment on paper counted less than anger on the phone. Later, in one of those pointless leadership workshops the company loves because they make cruelty sound developmental, I said resilience without authority was just inventory for future exploitation and ruined the afternoon for all the right people. None of those moments looked grand enough to belong in a success story. They still mattered more than half the polished wins upstairs. The same thing held outside the building. My mother once watched me answer 3 work calls in 12 minutes over dinner and asked whether I was trying to become important enough that ordinary evenings stopped counting. In Yuhyeon, I watched Hyeon make a director choke on his own theft when I forced him to explain a model he had been trying to wear as if it were his. At a budget breakfast, Kang tested whether I would trade one small staffing protection for prettier quarterly optics in another division. I asked him which name he wanted on the eventual apology. He hated the question, which usually meant the numbers under it were good. By then I had stopped treating those scenes as digressions. They were the actual career, not just winning large projects, but refusing to let small dishonesties accumulate into the next elegant disaster. The closer I got to deputy manager, the less the company asked whether I could perform, and the more it asked whether I could be trusted with what performance does to other people. That was the real gate. Not intelligence, not endurance, social permission to shape environments. Once I understood that, the coming move to organizational planning's deeper line stopped feeling like a reward and started feeling like a test I had spent 2 lives accidentally preparing for. Could I still climb while keeping the people nearest me fully visible? Could I manage men like Kang without becoming one? Could I stand in front of Chairman Han and answer strategic questions without letting his language colonize my own? Could I keep Jinhwan alive, keep Minjiang moving upward on her own terms, keep Seo from being quietly used up, keep my mother hearing my real voice on the phone instead of the company's better-trained imitation? Could I enter the rooms that decide everybody else's next 3 years and still come back down the elevator with enough of myself left to know what I had just participated in? Those were better questions than title. Harder, too. By the time quarter close approached and the move toward the deeper organizational planning line became real, I understood one thing with a clarity the first life never gave me soon enough. The top was never the real danger. The real danger was all the smaller victories underneath it where the company teaches you, one useful compromise at a time, that your reasons can be translated into its reasons if the compensation package and strategic language are elegant enough. I had not beaten that danger. Not even close. But I could finally see it while climbing. Good. That was the difference that mattered most. Not the extra years saved. Not the faster track. Not even the people I had already pulled back from edges they once fell over in the first life. Vision. The kind earned by damage, memory, and enough second chances to become responsible for what you still do with them. When I walked out of the building on the last late night before the new cycle started, Seoul looked the same way it always had. Too many lights, too many men trying to become larger than their sleep, too many rooms where polite language was covering some smaller, more honest violence. I looked back at Hansung's tower and felt no romance about it at all. Good. I did not need romance with the machine. I needed height, leverage, and the discipline to keep naming what it cost. That was what the next phase would demand. And this time, unlike the first, I was arriving there already knowing what I refused to call necessary on the way up. The new cycle began with a title 1 notch cleaner and a job 3 notches dirtier. Deputy manager in all but final stamp. Organizational planning, deep line support. Access broad enough to embarrass me if I used it badly, and narrow enough that every mistake could still be blamed on youth instead of structure. The room changed around me the first week. Secretaries stopped asking whether I needed somebody higher copy. Middle managers started phoning before sending the first draft instead of after. Two directors I barely knew suddenly remembered my full name at lunch. One vice manager who had ignored me for 18 months began speaking in that slow, respectful tone older men use when they are trying to decide whether respect is a better investment than early hostility. It wasn't status that changed the most. It was time. People gave less of it away around me now, which meant the work got truer faster and the lies arrived dressed better. My first major file in the deeper line was named Workforce Continuity Modernization, which should tell you immediately that someone planned to make a real wound sound like a brochure. The proposal covered 3 factories, 2 support centers, and 1 regional planning line. Officially, it aimed to prepare Hansung for the next competitiveness phase. Unofficially, it was an attempt to centralize labor exposure before the next downturn while claiming the move as rational maturity instead of preemptive fear. The ugly part sat in Ulsan again. Not the flood line. Secondary assembly support unit this time, one full of older technicians and process supervisors who did the kind of work nobody notices until it disappears, and then suddenly every restart takes 12 hours longer than it should. The proposal wanted to integrate competency layers by moving half the coordination upward, cutting support positions, and replacing experience-heavy roles with cheaper rotational management. I had seen the future version already, not through death. Through erosion, error, delay. One bad restart becoming 3, then 7, then a quality panic somebody later pinned on aging labor instead of planning arrogance. The meeting on it started at 8, and by 8:22, I knew half the room had already decided the men in Ulsan were a sentimental cost center. That was the thing about planning floors. They do not need to hate workers. They only need to stop feeling them clearly enough. I asked for restart delay variance by team composition. The line owner did not have it. I asked for maintenance learning curves after prior temporary manager insertion. The operations side called it too granular. I asked for quality slippage under supervisor rotation models. Finance asked whether we were planning a factory or a sociology degree. Good. That meant they were still in the wrong conversation. So I changed it. I put up the timeline from the earlier flood quarter. Restart sequence. Calibration risk. Support staff intervention minutes. The exact roles people now wanted to compress. Then I laid the proposed cut model over that history and asked the room one question. Which one of you wants to explain the first delayed restart to the export clients when the institutional memory you call expensive has already been optimized into retirement? Silence. Then paper moving. Then eyes shifting toward the side of the table where no one actually wanted to own the answer. Director Na backed me, which mattered. He did not do it because he had grown softer. He did it because I had forced the file into real cost instead of ideological vocabulary. Suman, attending halfway through because anything tied to future competitiveness suddenly interested him if it might later sit in a succession brief, listened for 15 minutes, and then asked whether I was simply defending old labor out of habit. I answered without waiting. No, I'm defending restart intelligence the company is pretending is decorative because it lives in older bodies. That landed harder than the room liked. The proposal did not die. Again, nothing valuable in Hansung ever dies cleanly if too many powerful men already touched it. But the cut depth reduced. The rotational manager insertions became paired rather than replacement. And most importantly, the older technicians in Ulsan got 6 more quarters of protected continuity under transition pay instead of 1 insulting handshake and a speech about modernization. When the revised file closed, Kang called me in and said, "You're becoming expensive in a very specific direction." That sounds like advancement. It sounds like a preference. He meant I was making a pattern out of attaching strategic strength to human retention in ways that could no longer be dismissed as sentimental flukes. Good. Let him name it. Once your enemies can articulate what makes you dangerous, at least they've stopped underestimating you. The same week, Jinhwan got his first real branch leadership offer. It came from the regional optimization line I had helped reroute him toward earlier. Team lead track, smaller district, bigger responsibility, and exactly the kind of job the old version of him would have accepted with grateful panic before asking whether the role was designed to grow him or use his reliability until something cracked. He came to my apartment with the offer letter folded in his jacket pocket and said, "You're going to tell me not to trust it." "No," I said, "I'm going to tell you to trust yourself more while reading it." That confused him enough to count as progress. He sat on the floor with takeout boxes between us, and for the first time I watched him read a promotion line the way I had always wanted him to. Not as praise, as design, reporting chain, budget control, escalation authority, who benefited if the district performed, who got blamed if the district's hidden backlog surfaced under him. By the end of an hour, he looked up and said, "This isn't a reward, it's a pressure chamber with better stationery." I almost laughed from sheer relief. "Yes," I said, "now decide whether it's the kind that makes you sharper or just older." He took the job. With conditions. Named staff support. Clear sign authority. Escalation protection written into the acceptance chain. Watching him do that felt better than half my own titles ever had. Minjiang's next war came through success. That sounds obvious until you work long enough in a big company to realize failure rarely scares people as much as the wrong person succeeding clearly. By the time her revised brand line for 2 major products had stabilized market perception and improved complaint recovery curves, the men above her had lost the right to call her merely promising. That meant they had to choose a new tactic. They chose containment through promotion styling. Broader title, more meetings, more cross-functional exposure, less actual authorship over the lines she had proved she could read better than they did. The offer looked flattering. It was a velvet downgrade. I saw it immediately, so did she. We met in the 11th floor pantry again, same dead machine, same bad fluorescent light, and she dropped the draft roll description on the counter and said, "Tell me if I'm just paranoid." I read it once. "Brand integration liaison," I said. "Exactly. They're trying to give you more visibility and less leverage. They're trying to make me present in rooms instead of decisive in them." I set the paper down. "Then don't refuse the promotion, redefine it before they finalize." That was the path, not moral victory through rejection, structural survival through better design. We rebuilt the role proposal together. Not in secret. That would have been too easy to dismiss later. Clear ownership clauses. Named final authority on product-side consumer trust correction. Direct performance metrics tied to actual outcome rather than collaborative strategic influence. And most importantly, one line stating that liaison authority did not override authorship origin on brand corrective strategy. Dry, technical, essential. It prevented the promotion from becoming a decorative parade route where every good idea left her desk and came back wearing somebody else's title. The meeting on it with her division head was one of the cleanest professional pleasures of my whole second life. Not because I spoke much, I didn't. Because she did. Calm. Exact. No gratitude performance. No apology for seeing the trap before entering it. At one point, the division head tried to soften the authorship line by saying, "At higher levels, contribution becomes collective." Minjiang smiled and answered, "At higher levels, theft also gets better formatting. I prefer cleaner wording." I had to look down at my notes for a second because if I laughed there, I would have ruined art. She got the revised role. Not because the division head suddenly respected women properly. Because the paper was stronger than his room, and the timing made refusing too visible. That is often enough. Not justice. Enough. Afterward, we walked out to the stairwell because elevators are too public for the kinds of silence that follow real wins. She stood by the window slit, folded the final memo once and said, "You know the dangerous thing about this? That it worked. That I'm starting to expect to be able to fight rooms like that." I leaned against the wall. "That sounds healthy." "It sounds expensive." "That too." She looked at me for a moment and then said, very quietly, "You make it easier to remember I'm not unreasonable." There are sentences you carry for years because they arrive without performance and without witnesses. That was one. I answered carefully. "You were never unreasonable. The rooms were just built around worse assumptions." The silence after that was not empty. It was crowded with all the things we still weren't saying because timing, ambition, and simple fear of ruining something structurally rare had not yet agreed to let us speak them. Then her phone rang. Of course. Work always saves people from themselves right when they're about to say something useful. She answered, rolled her eyes halfway through the first sentence, and mouthed, product again. I smiled despite myself. That was the whole thing with us by then. No confession. No clean category. Just repeated proof under pressure that the other person was seeing the same battlefield clearly enough not to let you go blind in it. Which, to be honest, was much more dangerous than romance. At the same time, the company kept trying to turn my own rise into mythology. That is how institutions neutralize younger threats they can't yet crush. They make the person into a story first. Stories are easier to absorb than methods. I started hearing versions of myself in corridors I had never actually lived. That I had the chairman's private favor. That Kang was secretly grooming me for his own line. That I had some outside political sponsor. That my rise was driven by impossible luck, impossible shamelessness, or impossible calculation. The truth, which would have sounded much stranger, was that I was simply reading the company 20 years ahead of everybody else, and trying not to let the read turn me into the same polished predator one cycle earlier. The most useful answer to mythology is still not denial. It is work so specific it keeps forcing the room back into the real. So I kept building files nobody could reduce to charisma. Kept credit chains clean. Kept names attached. Kept using rooms instead of performing in them. And every so often, when the office got too loud with versions of me I didn't want becoming folklore, I went to the pantry, or the roof, or my mother's apartment, or a late train platform, and reminded myself of the simple thing underneath all the strategy. I had not come back for legend. I had come back for sequence. The next big conflict did not come from above. It came sideways, which is often worse. A group of mid-level managers across product, sales, and procurement started coordinating informally against organizational planning's deeper review reach. Not openly. That would have been stupid. Through delays, selective information, and controlled incompetence. Files arriving 12 hours late in slightly wrong formats. Misunderstood headcount assumptions. Supplier notes stripped of contextual appendices. None of it large enough to accuse cleanly. All of it designed to make my floor look overcomplicated and slow. It was classic middle management insurgency. If you can't beat the smarter room, flood it with sludge until the smarter room looks arrogant for complaining about mud. Director Nuss saw it. So did I. The rest of the floor mostly just grew tired. That was the dangerous part. Deliberate sloppiness works best not when it fools people, but when it exhausts them into accepting lower quality truth as the only workable version. So I built a countermeasure so boring no one noticed it was a weapon until it was already in use. Submission architecture. Nothing more glamorous than that. Single format intake. Visible revision ownership. Late file tags that could no longer disappear into email ambiguity. Cross-line timestamp summaries sent weekly not upward first, but sideways to all participating divisions, so every manager could see exactly whose teams were still acting like the process was optional. At first they mocked it. Paper hygiene. Planning theater. Young manager control nonsense. Then the weekly tags started biting. One product manager showed late 3 weeks in a row. A procurement deputy's missing appendices suddenly became visible as a pattern, instead of one bad week. Sales could no longer pretend regional summaries had arrived late from branches when the branch timestamp sat right there on the page proving otherwise. Nobody got fired. Good. I wasn't looking for drama. I was looking for friction. By week 6, late file discipline had improved across 4 divisions. The insurgency lost its favorite fog, and Director Nuss stopped by my desk just long enough to say, "You weaponized paperwork. The building should be ashamed of how much I respect that." I told him shame was beyond the budget. He said that sounded like a future executive line. I said that sounded like a threat. At the same time, the first real cost of my outside reputation landed on my mother. Nothing dramatic. Again, real life is usually uglier and smaller at first. Someone from church, one of those women who collect prestige through relatives and marriage achievements, mentioned that my name had come up in a business article, and then added, with smiling poison, that men who rise too fast in large companies usually end up either owned or lonely. My mother repeated it to me over dinner as if it amused her, and not because it had stayed under her skin all afternoon. I looked at her, at the soup, at the plant by the window she still kept alive despite all reason, and felt a different kind of anger than the office usually gave me. Not strategic. Personal in a clean way. Did it bother you? I asked. She hesitated. That was answer enough. Then she said, I don't care what people say about status. I care whether the people who love you still recognize you faster than the company does. That line sat between us for a while. In the first life, I would have made a joke and changed the subject. This time I stayed in it. I'm trying, I said. I know, she answered. That's why it still worries me. That was the thing. Not that she doubted me. That she understood the scale of what I was trying to do well enough to know effort alone never guarantees the man comes out intact. After dinner, I washed the dishes without being asked because I needed the motion. She watched me for a while and then said, Do you remember when you were 11 and insisted on carrying all the grocery bags at once because you wanted to prove you were strong? I laughed despite myself. I dropped the soy sauce. You dropped everything but the soy sauce, then cried because you were embarrassed, not hurt. That sounded exactly right. Also too familiar. She dried one bowl and added, You still do the same thing. Try to carry too much in one trip because part of you believes dropping any of it means you were never strong enough to deserve it. There it was. The language, which somehow always finds the bone under the suit. So I changed something after that conversation. Not at work. In life. I stopped taking every late call. Not all enough. I made Sunday evenings actually mine, unless the building was on fire or planning to pretend it was. I told Jinhwan no once when he tried to route 3 branch complications through me just because he knew I'd answer fast. I let Hiren solve one escalation without stepping in early, even though the room made me itch. I trusted Sujin to fight one supervisor directly because that was her line, not mine. And when Minjiang sent a message at 11:48 p.m. asking if I was still in the office and wanted ramen from the convenience store downstairs, I said yes without pretending we were discussing file efficiency. Small things. Important ones. Because the company was still winning too much of me through urgency. And if I wanted the second life to mean more than just improved strategy, I had to start defending ordinary human ground with the same seriousness I used in board-adjacent war. That is less glamorous than career narrative. It is also where careers most often steal what later looks irreplaceable. The final big conflict before the cycle turned wasn't a scandal, a flood, or a review war. It was a succession rehearsal. Those are worse because everyone behaves beautifully while the knives are being sharpened. Chairman Han wanted a 2-day internal strategy retreat with only select executive line, succession line, and planning line people present. No press, no formal board, no outside record except the one the chairman's legal aid would eventually decide existed. In practice, that meant Suman, Kang, CEO, Director Na, 2 finance men, 1 legal strategist, and to my surprise me. Not because I belonged there. Because the company had reached the stage where my absence from a room would itself have started saying something. The retreat took place at a private estate outside Gapyeong where the air looked too clean to trust, and every table was arranged as if corporate conflict became nobler once given enough polished wood. The agenda talked about 10-year resilience, generational transition, portfolio rationalization, and leadership continuity. The real discussion, of course, was much simpler. What kind of company did Hansung intend to become once the chairman loosened his grip enough for other appetites to move honestly? There were 3 broad camps, though no one would have used that word in front of a secretary. O's camp wanted cleaner numbers, harder central control, and a future where the company became more efficient by making every human truth arrive thinner and later. Kang's camp wanted flexible power, selective honesty, and enough internal fear to keep strategic options open under changing markets. CEO and Na, different men, different styles, wanted a company still capable of hearing operational truth before it became catastrophe, which in Hansung already counted as almost radical. Suman was still deciding what kind of heir he wanted to be. That made him the most dangerous man in the room after his father. My role wasn't to speak often. It was to listen for the place where the room's theory of the future stopped matching the lived cost beneath it. That place arrived through a deceptively dry agenda item, integrated leadership acceleration. Legal strategists proposed widening rotational exposure and tightening performance sorting so high-potential leaders could be identified faster and placed into broader system seats before local loyalties made them too narrow. Sounds harmless. It was. In practice, it meant earlier uprooting, more controlled dependence on central sponsorship, and less time for younger managers to build grounded judgment outside whichever patron happened to own their next file. I knew that system. I had survived it once. It works beautifully if what you want are faster executives and thinner humans. Yuhyeon liked it. Of course. It looked elegant on paper and solved one of his deepest insecurities by making future leaders more visibly attached to central legitimacy instead of local competence. Kang liked parts of it because earlier sorting gives predators cleaner options. CEO disliked it on sight. Not disliked it in the middle, which is where his mind always worked first. The chairman let them talk. Then he turned to me. Han? Yes, sir. If accelerated rotation produces stronger executives faster, why resist? The whole room went still in that way. Only very expensive rooms can. No one moved. No one sipped. Even the outside birds seemed to have signed an NDA. I answered with the real thing. Because faster executives are not automatically stronger leaders, sir. Rotation without grounded accountability often just teaches younger managers how to become adaptable to power before they become responsible to reality. Finance shifted. Legal frowned. Yuhyeon's jaw tightened. I kept going because the first sentence had only opened the cut. If their first serious loyalty is to the patron moving them instead of the people and systems they're supposed to understand, then they learn how to translate damage upward elegantly before they learn how to prevent it. That helps succession. It doesn't always help the company. No one interrupted. Good. That meant the line had landed deep enough not to be easy to dismiss as youthful idealism. The chairman asked, and your alternative? Longer field anchoring before cross-line acceleration. Rotations that preserve one rooted accountability line instead of only central sponsorship. Promotion frameworks that reward not just project wins, but whether the people under the candidate produce better after him instead of simply surviving harder. That last part was the real answer. Everything else was architecture around it. The chairman looked at Yuhyeon then, not me. Interesting. Then at Kang. Then back to the papers. He said draft both models. That was all. But it meant the question had shifted from abstract policy into competing futures with paper behind them. The rest of the retreat blurred after that. Portfolio talk, export exposure, pension pressure, soft warfare and expensive language. Yet the room had already changed. I could feel it, not in praise, in the way everyone recalculated distance. That night after the final session, I walked alone down to the edge of the lake, because the estate was too polished, and my head needed air that did not smell like men deciding how much of other men should be movable. Yuhyeon found me there. Naturally. He stood beside the rail and said, "You enjoy making future planning sound morally compromised." I almost laughed. Future planning is morally compromised. That's not an answer. It's the necessary part before one. He folded his arms. You make everything harder. No, I make the hidden part louder. He was quiet for a while, then he said, "You know what I think? That this is where you tell me I mistake disruption for principle." No, he looked out at the water. "I think you're trying to build a company that would never have needed the man you became later." That hit harder than anything the chairman had said all day. Because it was true. Because he had seen it. Because for one dangerous second, under all his inherited insecurity and polished ambition, he had said something completely clean. I didn't answer right away. Then I said yes. He nodded once as if that completed something in his head. That sounds expensive. It is. Good, he said, and walked away before I could decide what to make of that. The next morning, on the drive back to Seoul, I looked at the draft notes in my lap and understood the first enormous chapter of the second life had finally crossed into its real next shape. No longer just intercepting disasters. No longer only saving specific people from specific traps. Now I was in the design fight. The fight over what kind of future the company would mass produce once the current old men stopped being able to carry all its contradictions in their own bodies. That is the true top floor war. Not title. Not applause. Not the clean board photo. Design. And I had finally entered it early enough to matter. After the retreat, the same pattern kept resurfacing in different clothes. At breakfast, one operations director tried to turn a plant delay into a local attitude issue, which was a lovely way of blaming underfunding on the people closest to the machines. I asked him which line item in the budget corresponded to attitude, and let the silence do the rest. Jinhwan, meanwhile, sent back his first district plan covered in handwritten challenges a younger version of him would have swallowed whole. I approved every one of them and told him discomfort was often just self-respect arriving late. Watching him sharpen without hardening into bitterness did more for me than half the praise I received upstairs ever had. Sujin brought me proof that the purifier changes were reducing not only complaint volume, but the apologetic tone customers used before they even finished describing the problem. We put that into the review pack because dignity is a business metric if you stop being lazy enough to ignore it. On another night, Minjiang and I missed the same train after a review ran long and stood under a leaking overhang with convenience store coffee cooling in our hands. Nothing dramatic happened. That was exactly why the moment mattered. Some feelings stay cleaner when neither person tries to seize them before the architecture around them can hold the weight. Rest came in smaller, meaner forms. A finance rumor suggested my rise must have come from the wrong kind of private weekend, because actual work was too offensive an explanation for certain men's comfort. I answered by sending the cleanest divisional correction memo of the quarter straight through that chain before lunch. Later, at a supplier plant in the south, Dongmin caught an equipment replacement deferral hidden under maintenance language so polite it almost qualified as literature. We moved before the line failed and saved 3 weeks of future blame from being born. Those scenes never looked grand in isolation. Together, they taught the same lesson. If you want a company to stop lying elegantly, you have to force its smaller habits to face daylight long before the flagship crisis arrives. When I finally stepped off the train back in Seoul after the retreat, I did not feel promoted. I felt committed. That was different. Promotion is still mostly about the self, no matter how many speeches try to wash it in duty. Committed means the work has crossed some invisible line where you can no longer pretend you are only climbing for your own future without sounding ridiculous even to yourself. I walked out of the station, called my mother first, then Jinhwan, then Minjiang, because by then that order had become its own kind of internal compass. My mother asked if I had eaten. Jinhwan asked whether rich men in retreats still managed to make stupidity sound educational. Minjiang asked what the air in the room had felt like after the answer landed, which was exactly the question I most wanted someone to ask. Colder, I said. Good, she replied. That means they heard it before they translated it. That was the thing I was learning to value most in the second life. Not just truth, time. Time before the translation. Time before the company's better language could turn a human fact into a strategic weather pattern and call the transformation maturity. If I could keep buying that time, through files, through rooms, through people, through design, then maybe the top would not be empty if I reached it again. Maybe the applause would still be hollow. Fine, but maybe I wouldn't be. That was enough to keep climbing. More than enough, actually. Because by then, I finally knew the shape of the war. Not man against man. Not division against division. Not even air against air. Language against consequence. Design against memory. The company's polished theory of what leadership requires against the stubborn, repetitive evidence of what real people underneath it keep paying. And this time, unlike the first life, I was already in the room while the theory was still being written. Good. Let them write. I had a pen too. The first quarter after the retreat proved something I had suspected and still underestimated. Once enough people realize you are fighting over design, not just incidents, the resistance changes species. Before, men opposed me by hiding facts, delaying files, rerouting blame, or trying to keep me socially unsupported. All ordinary enough. After the retreat, some of them started doing something smarter. They began agreeing too quickly. That is a much more dangerous enemy move. Agreement lets bad systems absorb criticism and come out looking modern without changing their appetite underneath. Suddenly, the same vice managers who had once rolled their eyes at field dignity metrics were talking about human-centered resilience. The same directors who treated staffing as whether we're praising sustainable leadership continuity. The same men who had built half their careers on asking younger managers to endure in silence had discovered a public vocabulary for care. Not because they had changed, because they had realized the language was now expensive enough to imitate. I hated that instinctively. Then I forced myself to respect it. Imitation still changes rooms. You just have to keep pushing until the performance becomes structurally inconvenient not to follow through. So I adjusted my method again. No more winning only by exposing the lie. Now I had to build implementation traps for hypocrisy. If a senior man praised field-rooted leadership, I put branch retention metrics in the follow-up file and asked him to sign the target. If a vice manager started talking about sustainable talent flow, I asked what percentage of rotational assignments retained one rooted accountability line, and by whose authority the exception cases would be reviewed. If the company wanted to celebrate customer trust language, I made sure service shame reduction scores sat beside the sales recovery charts in the next review pack. That did two things at once. It made the performative men resent me more. It made some of the younger ones realize there was a method for turning philosophy back into work before the philosophy could escape into wallpaper. Jinhwan noticed first. She came into my office with a half-finished implementation grid and said, "You've stopped arguing the principle and started building follow-up cages." That sounds unflattering. It sounds effective. Good. She tapped the page with her pen. Were you always like this? No. I used to mistake sharpness for adulthood and loyalty for intelligence. I used to think surviving the room was the same as mastering it. I used to build great outcomes on top of damaged people and call the result leadership because the shareholders never met the funerals. Instead, I said, no, I just had a very expensive education. She seemed to hear more in that than I had spoken, which was one of the reasons I trusted her. Then she nodded and said, "Fine, teach me the cheaper version." So I did. Not by mentoring speeches. By work. Where a file turns. How to see whether a praise line is meant to be implemented or only repeated. How to identify the one metric in a room everyone keeps talking around. How to ask a question sharp enough to force specificity without giving the room a clean excuse to call you emotional or naive. How to know when a senior is actually listening and when he is merely deciding which parts of your intelligence can be worn safely above you. That, I realized, was part of the environment work too. Not just saving people from individual traps. Teaching the next ones to spot the teeth before they bit. The first time I saw Minjiang lose her temper cleanly, it was beautiful. Not loud. Not theatrical. Just clean. Packaging review for a new home care line had devolved into exactly the sort of male vanity circle she hated most. Four men discussing whether customers in higher-income districts preferred quiet confidence or aspirational modernity, as if these were natural species and not phrases invented by agencies to justify invoices. Minjiang had already explained twice that the actual complaint trend tied to setup friction and maintenance clarity. They kept dragging the room back toward self-congratulatory atmospherics, because atmospherics allow mediocre men to sound expensive. Finally, one director said, "Let's not reduce the premium consumer experience to operational housekeeping." She set her pen down. That was the only warning. Then she said, "The premium consumer experience appears to be 300,000 won, and a woman in Bundang feeling stupid at 10:40 p.m. in front of her children because your setup language still prioritizes tone over usability." No one moved. She kept going. If you want to keep discussing mood boards after that, at least have the decency to admit you're choosing your own comfort over the thing we're paid to fix. I felt the room harden and crack in the same second. One younger manager looked openly shocked. One older one looked offended in the way only mediocre power can manage. The division head finally did the thing I had been waiting for all year. He stopped trying to smooth her and started taking notes. After the meeting, I found her in the corridor by the service stair, with her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was holding herself still on purpose. "You were right," I said. "That sounds dangerous coming from you. You were also elegant." "That sounds false." "No, you gave them the customer and the hour. That was the kill shot." That finally got the smallest smile. She leaned back against the wall and looked at me for a second. "Do you know the problem with working near you?" "Several. You've made it much harder to sit quietly in stupid rooms." I let that sit between us. Then I said, "Good." She laughed once, tired and real. "Yes, that's the problem." We stood there a little longer than either of us needed to. No one came through the stair. No calls yet. No report urgency clawing at the edges. Just fluorescent light, concrete, and the kind of narrow peace companies only accidentally allow between one conflict and the next. Finally she said, "If this gets worse later." She stopped. That alone was enough to make my pulse shift. "If what gets worse?" I asked carefully. She looked straight at me then, which almost no one at Hansung ever did when the room was this close to honest. This, she said, the way we work, the way we keep ending up on the same side of rooms, the way you make me think better and angrier and somehow less alone in it. There are moments where every clean adult answer arrives at once, and none of them save you. I chose the only honest one available. Yes, I said. No flourish. No shield. Just yes, because pretending not to understand her would have been cowardice, and pretending the timing no longer mattered would have been stupidity. She exhaled slowly. That's incredibly inconvenient. I know. Good. Then her phone rang and she looked at the screen, laughed once without humor and said, "See, the company heard us." We both knew this wasn't solved. How could it be? Not in that building. Not at that altitude. Not while the work still mattered so much, and the wrong rumor could still turn one real feeling into 3 ugly explanations before lunch. But the silence had broken. That mattered. Not romance. Not yet. Truth. More dangerous. The next meaningful shift came through Jinhwan. He failed. Not catastrophically. Better. His first district quarter as branch optimization lead came in under target by just enough to create the exact kind of nervous management, whether that ruins decent men if they still think targets are mostly about effort. In the old life, something like that would have broken him inward. He would have worked later, apologized more, let the room define the shortfall as personal deficiency, and carried the whole thing home until it changed the way he spoke to himself. This time he called me first. That alone felt like changing history with a crowbar. He sounded furious, not ashamed. Better. He said the district target had been set off false recovery assumptions and one retailer had reported phantom channel optimism to protect his own standing. He had the numbers. He also had, crucially, not yet agreed to frame the miss as his failure. So I asked the first important question. Do you need me in the room, or do you need me to help you build the room? He was quiet for a second. Then the second. That was it. That was growth. We rebuilt the review sequence over one ugly Saturday. Retailer assumption correction first. Target baseline challenge second. District performance explanation third. And only after all that, his management response. And he went into the review on Monday. He did not sound defensive. He sounded clear. He forced the regional director to acknowledge the inflated target basis before discussing execution. The room still hurt him, of course. Rooms always do. But it could no longer turn him into the whole story. By the end of the week, the target was formally recalibrated, and the retailer who had faked the optimism was being watched much more closely by people with worse moods than mine. We had dinner after that in a tiny place near the station where the tables wobbled and the beer was colder than the chairs deserved. He sat back, looked at me over the food and said, "You know what the weirdest part is? That I eat like this and still pass for a future executive. No, that I didn't spend the whole week thinking I had to disappear a little to deserve staying." I put my chopsticks down. That was the line. The real one. Not quarter targets. Not branch optics. He had not disappeared. In the first life by then, he already had. So I raised my glass and said, "Good." He laughed. "You really have turned that into a whole philosophy. It's efficient. You're impossible. No, just expensive." That was the kind of conversation I used to think didn't matter because it couldn't be put in a deck or a board note or an annual review. I was wrong. These were the actual structural changes. The places where people stopped organizing themselves around old damage, even while the company still assumed the old pattern would hold. That was worth more than the title line. Maybe not to the market. To me. Chairman Han asked for me one last time before the year closed. Not in the big office. Not in the working dinner room. In the smaller side study with the older furniture and the fewer witnesses, which was always worse because it meant he wanted a person, not a performance. He was reading when I entered. No screens, no assistants, just one thick file and winter light at the window. "Sit," he said. I sat. He did not look up immediately. That too was deliberate. Let the younger man feel the scale first. The room smelled faintly of tea and old paper, which somehow made everything more dangerous instead of less. Finally, he closed the file and said, "You're becoming influential before you've become senior." That sounds unstable, sir. It can be. He studied me for a second. You interfere in systems before they fail publicly. You defend people when most young managers would defend only projects. You speak upward more directly than is normal for your line and have somehow not yet mistaken that for immunity. That last part almost counted as praise in his language. Then he asked the real question. Why stay? No softer frame. No corporate wrapper. Just why stay? I could have said loyalty. I could have said opportunity. I could have said Hansung scale still, made it the only real battlefield where certain things could be changed at meaningful speed. All true. Not enough. So I told him the actual thing. Because in my experience, companies like this do not become better by accident. They become better only when someone inside reaches enough height to stop calling the damage inevitable. He did not interrupt. I kept going because if a chairman asks you why you stay, you either give him the clean lie he already expects or the truth that will define your whole future line. I had already lived once on the other answer. I'm ambitious, I said. I plan to keep rising. But if all I do with that rise is become more elegant about the same sacrifices, then I'll just be one more man this company taught to mistake survival for leadership. Silence. Then Chairman Han asked, and you think you can avoid that? No one should answer yes to a man like him, not if they have any sense left. I think I can keep fighting it, I said. Something changed in his face then. Not warmth. Recognition of a different sort. He leaned back slightly and said, most people who come this far only want permission. There's plenty of that already. A tiny pause. Then the faintest line at the edge of his mouth, not approval, something drier and more dangerous. Good, he said, permission makes weak executives. That was the nearest thing to honest mentorship he ever gave me. When I left the study, I did not feel victorious. I felt warned, but warned in the useful direction. Because now I knew exactly what he saw when he looked at me. Not merely talent, not merely utility. A man whose greatest value and greatest risk were becoming harder to separate. Good. That meant the war was finally at the right altitude. And when I stepped back into the corridor, with Hansung still humming all around me in its usual expensive cruelty, I understood with a clarity so sharp, it almost felt peaceful that the first true giant stretch of the second life was done. Not because I had reached safety. There is no safety there. Because I had finally reached the point where the climb itself had changed shape. I wasn't just outrunning old disasters anymore. I was now in the design line, the succession line, the human line, the language line. Close enough to the company's own nervous system that every next move would matter less as rescue and more as authorship. That was terrifying. Good. It should have been. When I walked out into the cold that evening, the city felt exactly like it had on the night I died and nothing like it at all. Same river. Same towers. Same thousands of people inside fluorescent rooms trying to become larger than their exhaustion before age noticed first. But I was not the same man looking at them. This time I had arrived early enough to know what the top would cost before paying it in full. This time I had people still alive beside me. This time I had memory, ambition, and enough hard-earned friction left not to confuse the company's idea of success with my own. So I kept walking. Upward. Still upward. Only now, every step came with its own answer already built inside it. Not like that. Never like that again. The week after that meeting with the chairman should have felt like descent. Instead, it felt like pressure changing shape. People above me were more careful now, which sounds pleasant until you realize careful people are harder to read because they've stopped underestimating you out loud. Files arrived trimmed tighter. Meeting invitations came less as requests and more as assumptions. One legal review chain started copying me before the directors instead of after, which was its own kind of warning. The company had not promoted me into comfort. It had simply moved me into a zone where comfort would be used as bait more often and more elegantly. Good. I was finally old enough in this second life to know bait by the polish. The clearest proof came through one last small file at quarter close. Not a glamorous one, a training budget redistribution note. The kind of paper most ambitious men ignore because it looks administrative and smells dull. But buried in the training cuts was one decision that would have erased branch-level mentoring support in exactly the regions where younger managers had started resisting the old disappear quietly logic most effectively. In other words, the company was about to save a little money by thinning the one layer that had recently produced better humans. I took the file to Jiwon first, not because she outranked anyone, because if I was serious about building the next line differently, then she had to see how the logic worked before I solved it for her. She read the note once and said, "They're not cutting training, they're cutting resistance reproduction." That was such a good sentence, I almost wanted to frame it. "Exactly," I said. "So what do we do?" I smiled without meaning to, not because the file was easy, because the question was, we make the savings look stupid. That was still one of the oldest and most reliable methods in the building. We rebuilt the note around retention cost, supervisor error drag, regional escalation lag, and the replacement expense of teaching young managers the same lesson later under crisis instead of earlier under structure. Then I made Jiwoon carry the first version of the argument herself in the review room while I backed the data only when needed. She did it well. Better than well. Cold where the room expected nerves, precise where they expected theory. By the end of the session, the cut had been reduced enough to save the core branch mentoring line. And more importantly, she walked out of that room understanding exactly how much of organizational design is simply the repeated refusal to let bad savings sound intelligent. That mattered, because the second life had never really been about me alone. Not after the first year. Not after Jinhwan stayed alive long enough to sharpen. Not after Sujin stopped sounding like a woman, apologizing for field truth. Not after Hyrin learned to let analysis land without softening herself first. Not after Minjeong and I admitted at least enough honesty to stop pretending the space between us was only timing and coincidence. The company would keep trying to teach the next generation the same polished lesson. Fine. Then I would keep interfering in the curriculum. On the last night before the official cycle closed, I stayed later than necessary, not because of emergency, just because old habits still liked the building best once most of the noise had drained out of it. The floor lights were dimmer, printers quieter, the city outside black and silver and never quite asleep. I walked once through the line that now sat half, under my influence, looked at the desks, the stacked files, the cheap pens, the marked-up review packs, and thought about how much of a life gets decided in rooms no reporter ever photographs. That used to depress me. Now it felt more like instruction. If this was where lives got bent, then this was also where some of them had to be unbent before the damage became tradition. I shut off the last lamp, took my coat, and headed toward the elevator with the same thought that had carried me since the first morning under the desk on the 7th floor. Earlier, cleaner, not softer, never blind again. The doors opened. I stepped inside. And when they closed on my reflection, I didn't see a future CEO or a reborn genius or some ridiculous chosen strategist from a corporate fantasy. I saw a man still climbing, still dangerous, still unfinished, and finally high enough to know that unfinished was the only honest way to stay worth trusting on the way up. One more thing changed before the year finally turned. I stopped saying, "when I get to the top," in my own head. Not because ambition disappeared. It didn't. If anything, it had become clearer, harder, and less decorative than before. But the phrase itself had started sounding wrong. Too singular. Too final. Much like the first life's lie that there exists some clean summit where all the compromises retroactively become architecture instead of debt. There is. There are only altitudes. Each one with its own language. Its own seductions. Its own ways of teaching you that what hurt yesterday now counts as refinement. The first life taught me that too late. The second had taught it early enough to matter. So I changed the phrase. Not top. Range. Not victory. Position. Not someday I'll be powerful enough that none of this can touch me. Someday I'll be placed well enough that the company has to keep touching the truths it prefers to price from a distance. It sounds small. It is. That shift is the whole difference between a man who climbs to be admired and one who climbs because he has finally understood what the mountain is made of. When I walked into work the next morning, coffee still bad, lights still cruel, the building still full of men and women trying to survive their own usefulness with varying levels of grace, I felt it more clearly than ever. The rewind had never been about doing the same life better. It was about refusing the company's favorite ending for me, while still fighting hard enough to earn a different one inside its walls. That was the work. Still the work. And now, finally, I had enough height under me to start making other people's futures less accidental too.